It should have been nothing. Just one more routine sweep through the quiet corridors of the night sky, the kind astronomers perform so often that their minds drift while their hands stay trained on the instruments. The camera shutters blinked in their rhythm, capturing slices of the cosmos at intervals so predictable they almost felt like breathing. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth a second thought. And then, one frame broke the pattern. A single, blurred capture. Faint. Underexposed, barely more than a smudge against the background noise. But something about it resisted dismissal, the way a splinter resists the grain of wood. The automated system hesitated, so briefly most people would miss it. Then a small amber warning pulsed in the corner of the screen. Possible transient detected. Confidence level 42%. Verify manually. Normally, that message appears when a satellite clips the edge of the frame or when cosmic rays strike the sensor at an angle that creates fleeting, meaningless streaks. But this one was different. The alert wasn't triggered by brightness. It wasn't shape-driven. It wasn't even temporal. It was something subtler, something the machine recognized even if I didn't yet. So I stopped the playback, zoomed in, held my breath without meaning to. The smear wasn't aligned with the background stars. It wasn't parallel to the camera drift. It wasn't consistent with a passing meteor. It angled upward, shallow, deliberate, like a thin blade pressed gently against the darkness. Noise doesn't do that. Debris doesn't do that. And objects millions of kilometers away certainly don't do that unless they're moving in ways we don't fully understand. But before I could run a deeper analysis, the frame flickered. Just a tiny stutter. Then another. The system froze for a heartbeat, and the frame vanished from the archive. Not corrected, not tagged, not relocated, removed. You might think this is where the panic begins, but it isn't. Panic is loud, frantic, messy. What I felt was the opposite. A sharpened, intrusive quiet, like stepping into a chapel after someone has slammed the door behind you. Still, heavy, charged with something unsaid. In astronomy, deleting a raw frame is almost a sin. Every photon counts, every anomalous streak, every artifact, every flicker, no matter how trivial, becomes part of the long-term pattern we rely on to understand the universe. But this one was erased in under 2 minutes. Who or what decides that? That was the moment my internal compass shifted. The moment I felt, without yet knowing why, that whatever had slipped through the lens was not supposed to be seen. Not yet, not by us, not in that way. Before we go any further, let me ask you a question, not loudly but quietly, the way you ask something in a dark room when you're not sure you want an answer. If the very first image connected to this object was removed almost instantly, how many others do you think disappeared? Before anyone had the chance to notice, pause 1 second. Feel that thought settle, because that's where this story truly begins. Now, if you're still here, if you haven't clicked away, if you haven't dismissed this as coincidence, make a mental note or whisper it under your breath. I'm paying attention. You'll need that resolve, because what happened next wasn't just strange. It was the first domino in a chain of anomalies that would pull astronomers, amateurs, government researchers, and even old philosophy texts into the same orbit, an orbit none of us were prepared for. Let's return to that missing frame. In the raw data log, the system showed a gap. Frame 21407 skipped to frame 2409. A perfect omission. Only a single line remained in the audit trail. Flagged for quality control. Action purged. Quality control doesn't purge. Quality control annotates. The only people who purge are operators with access to the administrative layer, something only a handful of institutions possess. But the timestamp, that was the real anomaly. The purge happened 37 seconds after the frame was captured. No human reviews astrodata in 37 seconds. No team responds to an alert that fast. That means the system itself, or something linked to it, made the choice. And that begs a question. Why would an automated system dispose of an anomaly instead of preserving it? Unless the anomaly wasn't unexpected. Unless the anomaly was familiar. Unless the anomaly had been seen before, imagine a lock you didn't know existed, reacting to a key you didn't realize you had just inserted. That's what it felt like. But the universe has a funny way of revealing what we aren't meant to see. And despite the deletion, one artifact remained, the compressed thumbnail preview, low resolution. Barely a whisper of the original. It showed the streak again, thin, angled, impossibly precise. And something else. A faint halo around the object. Not bright enough to be a tail, not wide enough to be sensor bloom, not shaped like any instrument reflection. That halo nagged at me. A quiet contradiction. If this were noise, it wouldn't have structure. If it were debris, the outline wouldn't be so uniform. If it were a comet fragment, it wouldn't hold that shape while crossing a frame at that speed. But the thumbnail gave me only 2 seconds of analysis before it, too, blurred itself out. The system scrubbed the cached preview, not normal behavior, not even permissible behavior under standard protocols. And when I checked the server logs again, a new line had appeared. Metadata reconstruction initiated, source integrity mismatch, file override recommended. Override recommended is just a polite way of saying someone or something doesn't want you asking questions. You may think I'm exaggerating. You may think this is just digital noise or sensor malfunction, but let me leave you with this. In 2 decades of handling astronomical data from dozens of instruments across multiple continents, I have never seen an automated pipeline delete a raw frame in its thumbnail preview within 90 seconds of capture. That doesn't happen. It's not procedure. It's not protocol. It's not even an option the system should execute without human approval. And still, it happened. Which leads to the question I found myself repeating as I stared at the empty metadata slot where the frame should have been. If the first glimpse of this object vanished so quickly, what does that say about everything that followed? Touch the thought gently. Don't push it away. Let it sit with you, because this is the threshold. The place where observation ends and investigation begins. And now, take a breath with me, slow, quiet. Because what comes next will make you wonder whether this missing frame wasn't just an accident, but the first whisper of something ancient stirring behind the curtain of the solar wind. There's a moment every observer dreads. Not the moment something strange appears, but the moment you realize the instruments are watching you as closely as you are watching the skete. That was the feeling when the telescope aperture blinked. Not literally, of course. Steel and glass don't blink, but data streams do. And the data stream that reached my console that night didn't fade, didn't flicker, didn't slump the way electronics do when a signal drops. It paused, balanced, held itself still in a way no machine ever should, as if something on the other side of the lens was holding its breath. We aren't supposed to use words like presence in astronomy. We talk about signatures, patterns, noise, signal-to-background ratios. We talk about measurable things. But when the aperture blinked back, none of those words fit. The log entry was simple. Telescope feed interrupted. Duration, 1.38 seconds. Cause, unknown, unknown. A word so common in astrophysics that most people overlook its gravity. But in raw system logs, the diaries of a machine, it carries weight. There are only 3 reasons a telescope loses vision for exactly 1.38 seconds. 1. The instrument shutters freeze. 2. A calibration script overrides the feed. 3. An object passes between the telescope and the sky. None of those matched what happened. The shutter did not close. The calibration module was inactive. And nothing, not a bird, not space debris, not a rogue satellite, could have crossed a 1.8-meter optical path that cleanly. Once again, the pattern didn't fit. That made the anomaly feel deliberate. The stream resumed as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Because when I replayed the feed frame by frame, looking for digital tears or corrupted pixels, I found something that should not exist. A single pixel, just one, shifting color in a way that no natural light source ever does. Not blue to white, not red to orange, but a deep spectral green to near infrared. And back again. Like a pulse, too fast for the eye, too clean for noise. That pixel pulse formed a rhythm. A rhythm that matched the timestamp of the missing frame from earlier. If the first anomaly was a whisper, this was a tap on the glass, Was it signaling, fluctuating, or simply reacting? We don't know. We still don't. But as I leaned closer, my eyes narrowing, my breath caught, halfway between disbelief and curiosity, something else revealed itself. A faint glyph of light, barely a ghost, etched along the left side of the frame. Not bright enough to be a structural reflection, not wide enough to be a smear. Not shaped like data compression noise. It looked like a curve, no, more like a hook, an arc that didn't belong. I isolated it, zoomed in, enhanced contrast. And while the outline dissolved into grain, the curvature stayed. A precise curvature. Astronomers learn early that precision is the enemy of coincidence. Nature rarely draws perfect curves in a single frame. If that was noise, it was the neatest noise I had ever seen. The strange part wasn't that the shape appeared. The strange part was that it looked familiar. Comet arcs aren't that smooth. CCD noise isn't that geometric. Instrument halos don't form shapes like that unless there's a reflective object right on the edge of the field. Which brought me to a thought I didn't want. What if the object wasn't in the captured frame, but just outside it? What if the telescope wasn't capturing it, but brushing against it? A presence sliding past the lens. Watching the watcher. You might be thinking, that's too poetic, too dramatic, too human. But let me remind you, our instruments are extensions of our senses. When something brushes past them, even the smallest ripple carries intention. Now, here's the detail that made my stomach tighten. When I pulled the feed metadata, something I hadn't noticed before emerged. The system time jumped, only by 0.004 seconds. A tiny skip, barely more than a blink. But time drift is not random. And a telescope doesn't miscount its own heartbeat unless something disturbs the sync between the onboard clock and Earth time. To put it simply, for a fraction of a second, the telescope lost track of where now was and regained it. Again, deliberate or not, it replicated human behavior. A blink, a question formed in my mind. Quiet, unwelcome, and cold. Was the telescope losing sight of the cosmos, or was it being asked to look away? That thought lingered long after the feed returned to normal, but nothing about that night stayed normal. A few hours later, a second observatory, halfway around the world using a completely different instrument, reported the same phenomenon, an interruption. 0.38 seconds, unknown cause, no shared software, no shared hardware, no shared atmospheric conditions, but shared timing? That's not noise. That's not coincidence. That is correlation. 1. Observatory blink is a malfunction. 2 observatories blink at the same time is a message, and we still hadn't seen the object. Not fully, not clearly, not directly, just its shadow, its wake, its impression on the instruments designed to ignore impressions. For a moment I wondered if we were dealing with some new kind of solar interference, something subtle and misunderstood. But solar interference doesn't create synchronized interruptions across continents. It doesn't carve smooth arcs into a single frame. It doesn't pulse a pixel in perfect rhythm with a deleted image. Before we proceed, I need to ask you something, honestly. If you saw a pattern repeating across different instruments, if data began lining up in ways pure coincidence cannot explain, at what point would you stop calling it random? At what point would you start keeping notes? If you're still here, if you can feel the edges of this story pulling tighter, say it again in your mind. I'm paying attention, because we are about to cross a threshold. Remember that arc I told you about? The glyph-like curve near the edge of the frame? It wasn't unique. Hours later, in a separate batch of automated thumbnails, system-generated previews meant only for quick navigation, I found a second curve. Fainter, shorter. Barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look, but identical in shape. 2 arcs, same curvature, same angle, same asymmetry, like a pair of mirrored parentheses closing around an invisible center. If it was natural, it would have changed between frames. If it was noise, it would have vanished differently in each capture. If it was sensor error, it would have repeated across the whole grid. But it didn't. It repeated only on the edges, only fleetingly. only where something might have passed. That's when the thought hit me. A thought so absurd I almost laughed. What if the object wasn't moving across the telescope's view? What if the telescope was moving across its? There is a difference, a profound one, because one implies we were watching it. The other implies it was standing still. That realization washed over me like cold water. And then the aperture blinked again. A second pause. Shorter than the first. Only 0.71 seconds. But unmistakable. 2 blinks, 2 arcs, 2 signals. A pattern was forming, even if we didn't yet understand the shape. And behind those patterns loomed a question that would follow me for the rest of this investigation. If something out there blinked back at our instruments, what does that say about how long it has been watching us? Touch that question. Hold it quietly. Because the next chapter will take us closer to the source, far closer than anyone wanted. You don't forget the first time the universe answers back. Not with a message, not with words, but with something far more unsettling. A frequency that should not exist in that place, at that moment, from that object. I was still reviewing the blinking aperture anomalies when the radio logs arrived. Quietly, without ceremony, as if they were just another nightly transmission. A junior technician forwarded them to me with a single line. "Sir, I think you should see this." No urgency. No panic. Just the tone of someone who knows they've stumbled on something they can't classify. The data came from Meerkat, one of the most sensitive radio arrays on this planet. It had been passively listening in the background, sweeping the sky in wide arcs when it caught a whisper, a thin spike rising from the noise floor, clean, sharp, surgical, a frequency at 174 MHz, the hallmark of hydroxyl emission. Nature's chemical fingerprint for water broken apart by sunlight, but that's not the part that froze me. Hydroxyl isn't rare. Many comets produce that frequency. What made this impossible was where it came from. The coordinates pointed directly to the region where the deleted frame would have been, and where the aperture blinked back. This was the first moment everything converged. The erased image, the blinking instruments, the repeating arcs. And now, a clean radio emission, all tied to the same patch of sky. The first instinct, of course, is to classify this as a comet, an interstellar comet perhaps, shedding water vapor as it approaches the sun. That explanation is safe, comforting, familiar. It gives the mind a place to rest, but the data refused to rest because the signal wasn't stable. It wasn't broad spectrum. It wasn't shaped the way comet emissions are shaped. Comet hydroxyl lines flare with solar heating. They rise gradually, peak near perihelion, fade slowly. They don't flicker, they don't pulse, they don't synchronize with optical anomalies. Yet this signal did. Every time the telescope aperture blinked, the radio frequency spiked. 3 milliseconds later, light speed synchronization between optical interference and radio emission. Natural objects don't coordinate themselves like that. I ran a spectrogram, flattened the noise, enhanced the drift. And there it was, a precise drop-off at the tail end of the emission, a sharp cut that no natural broadening mechanism could produce, like someone, or something, closing a door. If you're listening closely right now, you might feel a small tightening in your chest. That's your intuition doing the math. A natural comet would produce a soft curve, not a severed line. A natural comet wouldn't time itself with an optical event, and a natural comet absolutely would not produce what came next, a secondary harmonic, weak. Barely above noise, but real. 2 frequencies intertwined like 2 threads twisted into one. This is where most investigators would stop. They'd call it interference, atmospheric noise, satellite bleed, but Meerkat logs don't lie, and the array was pointed far from geostationary clutter. No known human transmission overlaps this band, and no terrestrial source could mimic the Kai-de-Tzeit. Doppler shift of an object moving tens of kilometers per second, that secondary harmonic shouldn't exist. Not in this context, not from an object we hadn't even seen clearly. But it did. And that was only the first anomaly. When the team cross-checked historical logs, they found something far more suspicious. This same frequency, this exact narrow band spike, appeared once before, 4 months ago. For 3 seconds, at the edge of the sun's glare, then vanished. Back then, the system tagged it as transient solar interference. Now we knew better. This wasn't solar. This wasn't terrestrial. This wasn't random. This was repetition, and when the universe repeats itself, it's telling you something. But here's the part that still unsettles me. When we triangulated the source, adjusted for Doppler drift, and mapped the path backward, the trajectory pointed to an inbound object moving on a hyperbolic course, not bound to the sun. Not from our system. Interstellar. The third confirmed visitor in human history. But unlike the others, this one wasn't silent. Before I continue, let me ask you something, directly, without softening the edges. When an object from deep space appears in our sky and begins emitting a frequency tied to the chemistry of water, do you assume it is simply melting? Or do you ask why it waited millions of years to speak here? If you haven't asked that question yet, ask it now, because this is where the clean science ends. And the investigation begins. I examined the spectrogram again, zooming into the noise floor. At first glance, it looked empty. Then something surfaced, subtle, almost accidental, a ripple, not in the signal. In the silence around the signal, as if the absence of noise had been shaped, carved into a narrow trench around the harmonic. There's only one known phenomenon that produces that kind of structured silence, absorption by complex molecules. But complex molecules don't survive easily in interstellar vacuum. Not unless they're shielded. Not unless they're inside something. Not unless the object isn't just shedding water, but revealing layers beneath it, layers shaped by a different star, different chemistry, different history. We were no longer listening to the universe. We were listening to its past, and yet the strongest piece of evidence wasn't scientific at all. It was human. When the detection memo circulated internally, the final page was redacted, not blacked out. Deleted. A gap. An empty space where conclusions should have been. Institutions don't delete conclusions unless those conclusions lead somewhere uncomfortable. You may think I'm drifting into speculation, but I want to remind you, every anomaly so far has aligned. Every strange occurrence points to the same thread, a visitor from beyond our system emitting a pattern of light and radio that refuses to behave like anything we understand. And then came the moment that removed all doubt. Something unprecedented was happening. A second observatory, not Meerkat this time, but a smaller array in Chile, detected the same signal, same frequency, same harmonic, same cut-off signature, except for one detail. It was stronger. Objects don't get stronger as they move away from the sun. Unless something about them is changing, unless something beneath the outer ice is awakening, unless heating is revealing chemical layers that have been locked away for millions of years, or unless the object itself is rotating and a previously hidden region came into view. One detection is chance. Two is pattern. This didn't just look intentional, it felt intentional. Now let me give you the moment that truly made my breath stutter. When I plotted both detections on a timeline, aligning the optical blink with the radio spike, the pattern formed a shape. Two peaks, separated by a clean valley with a rising slope at the end. That curve matched exactly, down to decimal precision, the outgassing profile expected when water sublimates from an object approaching perihelion, expected for a comet. Except for one final contradiction, the strength of the harmonic. No natural outgassing produces a harmonic at that amplitude. None. Not in any recorded comet, interstellar, or local. If this was natural, it was unlike any natural object we've ever observed. If it was not natural, then the implications speak for themselves. Before we move forward, hold this in your mind. A deleted frame, a blinking aperture, two matching arcs, a synchronized radio spike, a harmonic that shouldn't exist, a redacted conclusion. Ask yourself, honestly, at what point do these stop being coincidences and start becoming a message? Touch that thought. Keep it with you. Because the next chapter takes us to the moment the object finally revealed itself, and what emerged was not what anyone expected. There are moments in astronomy when the universe stops being abstract, stops being distant, stops being a place of equations and probabilities, and becomes a presence, not because of what you see, but because of what you almost see. This chapter begins with such a moment. The first partial image of the object, still nameless, still without classification, arrived just before dawn. Not a full frame, not a complete exposure, just an automated pre-capture reduction, the kind telescopes generate while adjusting brightness. A technical artifact. Yet that artifact contained the first hint of a shape. At first glance, it looked like a diffuse plume of light, ordinary, unremarkable, almost disappointing compared to the anomalies leading up to it. A haze, an overexposure, the kind of flare you get when sunlight strikes icy grains at the wrong angle. But when the brightness curve was flattened, when the flare was subtracted, when the noise was stripped away, something solid remained. A central spine. Sharp, thin, too razor-straight to be natural. Comets have irregular nuclei, lumpy, fractured, chaotic. Asteroids have rough silhouettes. Dust clouds have no structure at all. But this had symmetry. Not perfect symmetry. Nature never surrenders its chaos fully. But enough that your mind feels the pattern before your eyes accept it, like a rib, or the keel of a ship, or the spindle of a turning instrument. Still, I doubted it, so I reprocessed the image myself. This time, instead of removing the flare, I isolated its edges. And that's when the impossible geometry revealed itself. The plume of light was not expanding outward as dust normally does. It was curving, pulled, guided along an arc that matched neither solar radiation pressure nor gravitational shear, as if there was a structure inside the haze. Something redirecting the flow, something carving the light into form. Do you understand the weight of that? A structure inside light is like finding bones inside a shadow. But here's the part that made my throat tighten. The curvature matched the arcs we saw in the earlier frames. Same angle, same radius, same asymmetry. Those faint glyphs we dismissed as reflections or edge artifacts were now appearing in direct emission, not on the sensor. In the object, which leaves us with only two possibilities. Either the object has inherent structural geometry, or its outgassing is shaped by forces we don't yet understand. Neither answer is comforting. Natural objects don't sculpt their own light. Natural objects don't carve arcs in synchronized patterns. And natural objects do not hide structures inside their brightness profiles. Now let me show you the detail that truly changed everything. When I expanded the frame into the far end of the spectral range, into wavelengths human eyes never see, a faint line appeared beneath the plume, a silhouette, not round, not jagged, not random, a shape with edges sharp enough to sketch. Imagine a spindle, long and narrow, narrowing at the ends, widening at the center, rotating slowly enough that the reflected light forms a ribbon instead of a blur. That's what it resembled. Not a nucleus, not a rock, not a chunk of ice, but a body with proportion. When I first traced the outline with my cursor, my hand trembled, not out of fear, but out of recognition, as if some deep, archaic part of the brain knew this silhouette long before the data made it real. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence. Patterns in noise, a byproduct of the brightness correction. But then the rotation curve arrived. The telescope had captured 3 near-consecutive pre-captures, each one slightly shifted in brightness. When aligned and stacked, the central body showed motion. Not tumbling, the way comets tumble. Not wobbling, the way asteroids wobble. Not chaotic, controlled, a smooth, consistent rotation. A rhythm. 1 full axial turn every 17 minutes. That is unprecedented. No known interstellar object rotates that fast without tearing itself apart. No comet with that spin rate maintains its shape. No asteroid survives. And yet this object, this spindle, rotated with the calm precision of a lighthouse beam sweeping over dark water. Here's the part that shook me most. The rotation axis aligned perfectly with the radio harmonic detected earlier. Light, radio, motion. 3 different instruments, 3 different domains describing one thing: order. But the universe is rarely orderly. Chaos is its native language, so when something speaks in symmetry, in timing, in coherence, your mind goes somewhere it doesn't want to go. Let's step back for a moment. I want you to imagine the light again, the plume, the arc, the silhouette inside it. Now imagine you're standing in a dark room and a curtain billows just slightly. You don't see the person behind it, but you feel their outline. That was this moment, an object from another star, revealing a shape that shouldn't exist, a shape that looked intentional. Before we go further, I need to ask you something, not for effect, but because the answer matters. How do you react when the universe stops behaving like a place and starts behaving like a design? Do you avert your eyes? Do you rationalize? Or do you lean closer? If you're still here, you've chosen to lean closer. Remember that, because curiosity is the point of no return. Now let me give you the final piece of this chapter. The plume, the haze, the glowing envelope we assumed was simple dust, it wasn't uniform. There was a darker lane cutting through it, a thin parallel band running just slightly off-center, a shadow inside the light. That shadow matched the silhouette's rotation, matched its timing, matched its curvature, meaning the object wasn't just rotating, it was occluding its own brightness, like veins, or struts, or ribs. But nature doesn't make ribs around cometary nuclei. Someone sent me a message that morning. A colleague who had reviewed the same data, someone usually calm, measured, the kind of person who would never jump to conclusions. Their message was only 6 words. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? I didn't answer. Because by then I knew the truth we were both circling around. We weren't looking at dust. We weren't looking at gas. We weren't looking at debris. We were looking at a body with structure. Not uniform, not symmetrical like a machine, but structured nonetheless, a shape hidden inside the light, and once you see a shape, you cannot unsee it. I'll leave you with this thought before we move on. If the first clear glimpse of this object revealed geometry, and that geometry matched the arcs, the anomalies, the signals, then we are no longer dealing with a question of observation. We are dealing with a question of intention. Hold that. Feel the weight of it. Do not rush past it, because the next chapter is where the pattern deepens and the first undeniable clue emerges from. An unexpected source, an amateur astronomer, and his image changes everything. There is a rule, unwritten but understood by everyone who studies the sky. When institutions fall silent, amateurs speak. And sometimes what they reveal is far louder than any official statement. This chapter begins in a place no one expected, a modest backyard in southern Spain, under a sky so ordinary it could have been anywhere. The man behind the camera wasn't a professional. He wasn't funded, accredited, or protected by any agency. He was an enthusiast, one of thousands around the world who stay awake at ungodly hours chasing faint comets and transients. But he was consistent, meticulous. And on the night he took the photograph that changed everything, he was simply trying to document a meteor shower. He didn't know he captured something else entirely. He only realized it the next morning. Here's how it happened. At Aro 412, while his mount tracked the rising constellation Boots, a faint streak cut diagonally across the frame. Not unusual. Meteors do that. Satellites do that. Even distant space debris can make a brief cameo. But this streak was different. Its edges were too sharp. Its brightness too steady, its motion too controlled, and at the center of the streak, visible only when zoomed in, was a tiny dark notch, a notch that should not exist in a meteor's burn path, a notch that no satellite flare would produce. He didn't analyze it deeply. Not at first. He assumed it was a quirk of his optics, a smudge on the lens, a shutter artifact. But something told him to upload it anyway, one image out of hundreds, to a small forum where amateurs exchange their oddities and curiosities. He titled it casually, "Weird streak tonight. Anyone seen something like this?" Most users dismissed it. A few made jokes. One suggested it might be a dead pixel smear, but then someone cross-referenced the coordinates, and everything changed. The streak aligned with the same position of the sky where the deleted frame, the blinking aperture, the spectral arcs, and the impossible radio harmonic had originated, perfectly aligned, within less than 1/10 of a degree. Coincidence? In astronomy, coincidences that clean rarely stay coincidences for long. When I first opened his image, I didn't expect much. Amateur captures are usually noisy, uncalibrated, full of gradients and artifacts. But this one, it had clarity. Enough clarity that my pulse actually quickened. The streak had a bright leading edge, sharp, tapering, almost needle-like. But the trailing edge was smoother, feathered, as though the object was shedding something faint, something wispy, something that wasn't vapor or dust. And then there was the notch. A tiny V-shaped indentation cutting into the streak like a bite. Most would overlook it. But when I enhanced the contrast, I saw it wasn't random. The notch was positioned at the exact angle of the curvature discovered in Chapter 4. Same orientation, same offset, same radius of arc. It wasn't a defect. It wasn't noise. It was the object's silhouette, cast into the trail of light. Do you understand the weight of that? For the first time, we had an image that didn't just hint at structure inside brightness, but projected structure outward. The light bent around something solid, something with edges. And then came the detail that made this photo far more than an anomaly. The timestamp. The amateur photo was taken 3 hours before the telescope aperture blinked for the second time. 3 hours before the radio harmonic strengthened. 3 hours before the plume curvature sharpened. 3 hours before the silhouette inside the light became undeniable. This man, this casual skywatcher, had caught the object right as it began to change. Right at the threshold between what it was and what it was becoming. Now ask yourself, why did his consumer-grade optics catch a structure that billion-dollar instruments failed to capture clearly? That question lingered like a cold draft through the entire investigation. And it led to the next revelation. When I examined the file metadata, something impossible surfaced. His camera recorded a slight dip in ambient brightness for 0.16 seconds. Not the sky, not the sensor. The actual environment around him dimmed. Environmental dimming is virtually unheard of in amateur captures. It requires something to absorb or redirect light across a wide field, something dense, large, and close enough to affect Earth's ambient scatter. No meteor does that. No satellite does that. No passing aircraft does that. Objects that cause measurable dimming at ground level are kilometers across. And yet, there it was. A dip. Precise. Clean, subtle, as if something passed between Earth and the stars, just for a heartbeat, before accelerating out of the frame. Let me give you the moment my breath caught. When I overlaid his streak with the data geometry from the telescope, a pattern formed. The amateur streak wasn't random. It traced the exact direction of the object's rotation axis. He had captured it at the perfect moment, when the silhouette aligned with our line of sight, a 1 in a million chance, and he didn't even know it. This led to a question far bigger than the photo itself. If a backyard telescope captured more truth than official instruments, then whose truth are the official instruments showing? Hold that thought. Do not let it slip away. Because there is one last detail you need to hear. When the forum thread began to gain traction, small at first but undeniably growing, the original photo disappeared. The link broke. The thumbnail vanished. The file returned a generic hosting error. The user insisted he hadn't deleted it. Other members confirmed they'd seen it earlier. But the image was gone, completely. If that were the end, we might chalk it up to server failure. But 12 hours later, the user posted again. My email account got locked. All my captures from last night are missing, even the raw files. Think about that. Amateurs aren't monitored. Amateurs aren't censored. Amateurs don't get their raw astrophotography purged overnight unless the image wasn't just interesting, unless it was revealing, unless it showed something someone did not want visible yet. Fortunately, a few users had downloaded backups. And those files are the reason we are able to continue this investigation now. I want you to remember this moment because it marks the first time the object didn't just affect instruments or sensors or telescopes. It affected people, their devices, their data, their access. This is where the story stops being merely scientific. It becomes human. Before we move on, I want to ask you something directly. If an amateur photograph of a faint streak was benign, why did it vanish from every device that captured it? Why now? Why this object? Why this moment? You don't need to answer out loud. Just let the question live inside you. Because the next chapter will reveal why that photograph mattered and why the silhouette inside its streak was only the beginning. There are rules written into the bones of celestial objects, rules carved not by humans, but by physics itself. Spin too slowly and you become uneven, lopsided, easily perturbed. Spin too fast and you tear yourself apart. Every nucleus, every asteroid, every grain of solid matter in space obeys the same law. Rotation has limits. Violating those limits means destruction. But the object we were observing did not obey those limits. The first hint came from the amateur photograph, the one that briefly surfaced before vanishing across every device that held it. Embedded inside the streak, faint but measurable, was a brightness modulation. A rise and fall along the length of the trail. Subtle, rhythmic, repeating every 17.2 minutes. At first, the modulation seemed like an artifact of the mount. Maybe the camera tracking drifted slightly and caused the intensity to fluctuate. But amateurs know their mounts better than anyone, and this particular observer kept meticulous logs. His drift values were negligible, too small to account for what we saw. The modulation, therefore, wasn't an error. It was a signature. Rotation. But rotating what? A comet nucleus? Not possible. No comet with a length-to-width ratio even half as extreme as this object could survive a 17-minute spin without shredding itself into dust. We ran the numbers. And the numbers answered with the kind of silence that feels like being watched. A typical comet the size implied by its brightness should rotate once every 5 to 30 hours. Even the rare fast rotators, unstable, dying objects, barely squeeze into the 1-hour range. 17 minutes, that's suicide, unless the object isn't held together by gravity, but by structure. Before that thought could settle, something else emerged from the data. When we plotted the amateur photograph's modulation against the pre-capture frames from the observatory, the timing matched. Not roughly, not approximately, but precisely, down to hundredths of a second. 2 different locations, 2 different instruments, 2 different observers, capturing the same rotational rhythm. That's when I felt something shift in the air around me. Not fear. Fear is loud. This was quieter, a tightening, a realization forming not in the mind, but in the spine. Because once you have rotation, you can derive shape. So I began reconstructing the silhouette using the brightness angles from 3 separate captures. The process was tedious, but data rarely lies. And when the reconstruction stabilized, a form emerged, long, thin, tapered at both ends, like an elongated spindle or a rotating fin. The shape wasn't organic, it wasn't chaotic, it wasn't fractured, it was consistent. And that consistency defied everything we know about interstellar objects. The rotation axis was aligned, not randomly, not wobbling, but cleanly oriented toward the sun. Objects don't do that unless forced by torque or stabilized by mass distribution. This one felt balanced, controlled. Let me show you the moment the analysis crossed a line no natural explanation could cover. When I modeled the object's brightness along the axis, something unexpected surfaced. The brightest region wasn't at the center, where you'd expect a bulge or curvature. It was offset, slightly higher, slightly forward, like a weighted core, a core that rotated perfectly with the outer shell, a core that generated the modulation seen in the amateur photograph, a core that should not exist in a comet. I remember staring at the model on my screen, hearing the soft buzz of the server room behind me while the shape spun. It was elegant in a way nature rarely is, too consistent, too proportional, too deliberate. Still, I refused to jump to conclusions, so I asked the same question any cautious investigator would ask. What if this object is not whole? What if it is breaking apart, and the rotation signal is the last gasp of instability? A comforting thought, in theory. But the data refused comfort. Breaking objects drift. They shed mass asynchronously. They generate chaotic spirals of dust. They brighten with volatility. This object displayed none of those. No chaotic plume, no wobble in its axis, no fluctuation in its magnitude curve. It rotated with the monotony of a metronome. Then came the second anomaly. When we combined the light curve with the radio harmonic from Chapter 3, the 2 rhythms locked, not loosely, not broadly, perfectly. 1 pulse of radio emission for every full rotation. A 1-to-1 ratio. This was no longer coincidence. This was connection. Nature can produce correlation, but nature does not produce synchronization across different physical domains. Not like this, not with such mathematical neatness. We checked the timestamps again. Then again, then a third time. There was no error. 17 minutes per revolution. 17 minutes per radio spike. That's when one of the technicians whispered something I will never forget. It's like the rotation is answering. He didn't mean it literally, but the phrasing stuck. Because when rotation syncs with emission, when brightness syncs with radio, when structure syncs with harmonic, you start to wonder, who is synchronizing it? Before I go deeper, let me ask you a question, quietly, the way you'd ask someone who's just stepped into a room they don't realize is forbidden. If an object rotates with impossible speed, holds impossible structure, and emits signals aligned with that rotation, at what point does comet stop being the right word? Think about that. Don't run from it. Now let me tell you what happened next. The rotation shift began. Subtle at first, just 0.003 seconds shaved off each cycle. Then 0.005, then 0.019. Not enough to panic anyone, but enough to break the perfect rhythm, like a drumbeat being retuned, like a pendulum adjusting to a new weight, like something beneath the surface. Changing. Natural spin-up happens when objects shed mass, but this object wasn't shedding mass. Its light curve remained smooth. Its silhouette remained intact, yet it sped up. No mass loss, no torque event, no thermal forcing, just acceleration. And here is the part that made my breath stall. The acceleration matched the timing of the deleted amateur photograph, as if the object responded to being seen. A ridiculous thought, and yet the numbers lined up. Every time we observed it more clearly, every time an image surfaced briefly before vanishing, every time a system blinked or stalled or glitched, its rotation changed, not by much, but enough. Enough to feel like reaction. Let me give you the final piece of this chapter. The detail that pushed this investigation into territory few dared enter. Inside the light modulation, hidden in the troughs of the cycle, we found a secondary frequency. A faint, repeating oscillation every 2.1 minutes. Too fast for structural wobble, too slow for thermal release, too consistent for noise. The same oscillation appeared in the radio harmonic. Then in the plume curvature. Then, unthinkably, in the timing of the aperture blink. The object wasn't just spinning, it was beating. A rhythm inside a rotation, a pulse inside a spin, a signature inside a silhouette. Objects don't have signatures, bodies don't have embedded rhythms. Comets don't have internal timing, but this did. Everything pointed to one truth, a truth I didn't want to speak but couldn't ignore. We were observing an object with internal order, not chaos, not instability. Order. And order is rarely accidental. Before we move on, hold this question gently. If the rotation profile of this object cannot come from nature, then what or who shaped it? Because the next chapter reveals something even more unsettling. The object's rotation isn't just strange, it's impossible under known physics. And someone knew that long before we did. There's a particular kind of silence that settles in scientific institutions when something appears that shouldn't exist. It isn't the calm silence of confidence. It isn't the loud silence of panic. It's a managed silence, measured, intentional, engineered. A silence that feels like someone closing a door softly, not to avoid being heard, but to avoid raising suspicion. That was the silence surrounding the rotation data. When we submitted the early analyses, the anomalous modulation, the impossible spin rate, the synchronized radio harmonic, we expected at least a note of concern, a request for verification, a follow-up. Instead, we received a single automated message. Your inquiry is being reviewed. Additional information will be provided if deemed necessary. If deemed necessary. That phrase lingered in my mind like dust hanging in a sunbeam. Unsettling. A little too careful, because science never withholds information if deemed necessary. Only institutions do. At first I told myself this was bureaucracy, a backlog of requests, data overload. But then something strange happened. Our access to the shared database, which had been stable for years, began to shift. Not crash, not glitch, shift. Search filters disappeared. Historical entries relating to fast-rotating bodies were reclassified. Tags were renamed. Entire catalog sections moved behind administrative layers. It was subtle enough that casual users wouldn't notice. But we noticed, because they weren't reorganizing the database. They were burying a pattern that began long before we submitted our findings. The first missing dataset wasn't ours. It belonged to a research group in 2019, the year astronomers detected an interstellar visitor whose acceleration still has no natural explanation. Their raw files had been quietly moved to a pending review folder and never resurfaced. The second missing dataset was from a Chilean observatory in 2023, an anomalous fast rotator with a narrow reflective profile. Archived, flagged, relocated, then gone. The third dataset, this is where my breath caught, was labeled simply unclassified rotation signature, non-gravitational. The timestamp? 3 weeks before we observed our object. 3 weeks. Before the amateur photo. Before the blinking aperture. Before the deleted frame. Meaning someone knew an anomalous object was inbound. Someone had classified the data before the public even knew there was data. But what they didn't anticipate was how difficult it is to erase traces from a living system. Every file leaves fingerprints, log entries, cross-linked tags, index references. And once you know where to look, the silences themselves become loud. One log entry stood out. Rotation irregularities exceed model. Recommend temporary restriction until confirmed. Restriction, not review, not delay, restriction. As if the knowledge itself carried weight. Now let me take you into the moment everything crystallized. We finally gained access to a fallback copy of the internal rotation model, a forgotten backup on a secondary node, never intended for public eyes. When we opened the file, expecting to find attempts at recalculating or correcting the spin curve, we found instead an entirely different document. A classification matrix, rows of possible categories, gravitational rotator thermal outgassing candidate, fragmented nucleus, non-stationary reflector, artificial reflector. Unknown, most were common. Routine. Expected. But one entry, highlighted in faint gray, as though someone had tried to hide it without fully deleting it, stood out. Category 6, externally stabilized rotation. Externally stabilized. Do you understand the magnitude of that phrase? Objects don't stabilize themselves externally. Nature uses mass distribution, internal cohesion, geometric balance, but external stabilization implies something else entirely, intervention. Not necessarily intelligent, not necessarily mechanical, but something acting on the object. Something shaping or influencing its rotation. The next line was even more unsettling. Candidate matches 1. There was only one known case in the entire database, and it wasn't from our solar system. It was a declassified fragment from deep space monitoring in 1982, an object detected for 5 hours before disappearing behind the sun. No official explanation was ever released. The internal notes were vague. Rotation shift too controlled, not a body, not a flare, possible instrumental anomaly. But the real reason it was buried is clear now. Its rotation profile was almost identical to the one we were observing, 43 years apart. 2 separate objects, same rotation curve, same stabilization signature. Same impossible coherence. Either nature repeats itself in ways we have never understood, or something out there follows rules we have yet to learn. Let me show you the moment the room around me went completely still. When we overlaid the historical rotation data with ours, adjusted for distance, brightness, velocity, the curves matched. Not roughly, not vaguely. Precisely. The 1982 object rotated every 17 minutes and 5 seconds. Ours rotated every 17 minutes and 2 seconds. A difference of only 3 seconds. Across 4 decades, across interstellar space, across entirely different observation methods. That kind of consistency is not natural. It's crafted, engineered, or controlled by conditions we cannot yet describe. Still, what disturbed me the most wasn't the consistency. It was the note attached to the 1982 dataset. Classify and close, not for public dissemination. Classify, and close. Two words that say more than entire. Reports. Who decided this? And why did they think we were not supposed to see it? Before we move deeper, I need to ask you something you may not want to answer. If an object shows signs of external stabilization, if its rotation profile matches a buried case from 1982, and if both datasets vanish from the public record, who is deciding what we should know? And more importantly, what did they see in 1982 that made them classify the data before anyone could question it? Hold on to that question. It will matter, because we are about to uncover the next layer, the layer where rotation anomalies become motion anomalies, where the object stops acting like something drifting through space and starts acting like something moving with purpose. In astronomy, trajectories are sacred. Objects travel where they must. Mass determines the curve, gravity shapes the arc, and sunlight adds the faintest whisper of pressure, but never enough to rewrite the story. Trajectories do not improvise, they do not hesitate, they do not change their minds unless something forces them to. This chapter begins at 0341 UTC, the moment every model, every projection, every orbital path quietly unraveled. At first, the update looked trivial, a small wobble in the object's inbound trajectory. Barely measurable, barely noticeable. A shift of 0.00014 AU off the previous line. A scientist's instinct would be to ignore it, to blame atmospheric distortion or observation error or a measurement artifact. But the shift didn't fade with new data. It grew. At 0348, the offset doubled. At 0351, it tripled. By 0402, the object's predicted path had diverged so far from the gravitational model that the simulation began flashing red. Objects do not do this, not unless something is acting upon them. But what kind of force could tug an interstellar object sideways? A force strong enough to shift its path, yet subtle enough to avoid lighting up every instrument we have. We recalculated the trajectory manually. Then again, then with a separate model. All three outputs gave the same answer. This object was not following a passive gravitational arc. It was deviating, smoothly, purposefully, unnaturally. And the most unsettling part? The deviation matched the rotation curve. Every 17 minutes, right as the object aligned a particular section of its silhouette toward the sun, its path bent by an infinitesimal but measurable amount, rotation influencing trajectory. A body's spin altering its direction, not through outgassing, not through jets, not through thermal thrust, but through something else entirely. Before jumping to conclusions, we tried the conventional explanations. 1. Solar radiation pressure? Impossible. The object was too small, too dense, too inbound. Radiation could nudge dust, but never a structure of this scale. 2. Internal mass shedding? None detected. Its brightness curve remained perfectly stable. 3. Sublimation jets? No jets, no flares, no plume. Asymmetry. 4. Magnetic deflection? There was no magnetic field strong enough in that region to cause such a clean, rhythmic shift. So we asked the dangerous question, what if the object was adjusting its own motion, not through engines, not through thrust, but through something subtler, controlled mass distribution? Nature can spin a rock. But nature does not adjust its spin to alter direction. Nature does not synchronize rotation with trajectory shift, yet the object did. Let me show you the moment the impossible became undeniable. When we plotted trajectory deviation per rotation cycle, the graph formed a smooth wave. Not noise, not random, a wave with periodicity, with amplitude, with coherence. And at the peak of each cycle, the object's silhouette, according to brightness reconstruction, was oriented with its narrowest profile pointed toward the sun. A maneuver so delicate that no comet could replicate it. A maneuver that required understanding of torque, momentum, and angle. Still, even that wasn't the most unsettling part. When we fed the new trajectory into a backpropagation model, tracing the object's inbound path across the previous weeks, the line did not converge to interstellar origin the way it should have. It bent. Bending implies control. Control implies intention, and intention is something the scientific community is not prepared to discuss. Before you think I'm suggesting anything conclusive, let me be clear. We still do not know what this object is. But we do know what it is not. It is not a passive interstellar rock. It is not drifting blindly through gravitational wells. It is not following a path shaped solely by physics as we know it. Now let me take you into the moment everything tilted. A junior analyst, someone quiet, brilliant, usually unnoticed, came running into the control room with a printout in his hand. He had overlaid the object's current position with the predicted gravitational path. The two lines did not meet. They did not intersect. They did not even come close. The deviation was no longer a wobble, no longer a drift. It was a divergence, a clean break from its predicted orbit, a break that no natural force could justify. The room fell silent. Even the machines felt quieter. "We're not tracking a comet," he whispered. "We're tracking something that's choosing where it goes." Of course, that statement could not be spoken officially, not in a report, not in a memo, but everyone felt its weight, because the next piece of data confirmed our worst suspicion. The object accelerated, not toward the sun, not away from the sun, but sideways, a lateral acceleration inconsistent with any natural model, a sideways push, a correction, a course adjustment. The magnitude was small, but the direction was unmistakable. Objects do not correct course on their own. But something else bothered me even more. When we checked the archived predictions, the ones generated the night before, we discovered something chilling. The older models had already begun curving toward the new trajectory before the acceleration was detected, as if the predictive system had received updated parameters. Parameters no one in the room had entered. Someone, or something, had overridden the model. Now let me show you the moment that made the hair on my arms rise. When we compared the acceleration curve to the blink patterns recorded earlier, the timing was identical. Each blink preceded a trajectory alteration. Each blink matched a rotation cycle. Each blink aligned with the radio harmonic spike. Light. Spin. Radio trajectory. 4 domains, 1 rhythm. This was no longer data. This was choreography. The object wasn't just moving. It was performing a sequence. And sequences imply structure. Sequences imply repetition. Sequences imply purpose. Is purpose the right word? I don't know. But it is the only word that fits. Before we move on, I need you to ask yourself something uncomfortable. If the universe sends us a visitor whose path bends in response to forces we cannot detect, whose rotation synchronizes with its acceleration, whose movement defies gravity, what exactly are we looking at? Not who, not why, just what. Hold that question. Do not soften it. Do not let the mind retreat into convenience, because the next chapter is where the data stops being merely strange and becomes impossible. It is where the object performs a maneuver that no known natural body can execute, one that left observatories scrambling and forced one institution to issue a silent internal alert, a maneuver that changed the tone of the investigation forever. There are moments in an investigation when the air itself feels different, as if the world is waiting for you to notice a detail it has been whispering for hours. This chapter begins with such a moment. The object made a turn, not a drift, not a wobble, not a curve smoothed by gravity's long, slow hand. A turn, sharp, clean, deliberate. A maneuver no natural body in the cosmos of any known composition has ever been recorded performing. It happened at 0419 UTC. The observatory feed was stable. The trajectory had already diverged from gravitational expectations, but only slightly, subtle enough that someone less attentive might have missed the implications. Then, without warning, the object altered its path by 0.83 degrees, a tiny angle to the naked eye. But in orbital mechanics, a change that sharp is equivalent to ripping through the script of the solar system. To put it simply, the object sidestepped. There were no jets, no flares, no plume asymmetry, no brightening, no dimming, no thermal bloom, nothing that could produce thrust, nothing that should produce directional shift, and yet the object turned. The system threw warnings across every screen, non-gravitational deviation confirmed, vector anomaly detected, tracking, confidence reduced. Isolate cause. We halted all automated corrections. Manual tracking engaged. The room fell into a tensed, breath-held quiet. Any other object, any comet, any asteroid, any fragment, would have broken apart under the stress of a maneuver like that. But this object did not fracture, did not sputter, did not shed debris. It remained whole, coherent, stable, as if the turn cost it nothing. Before we trace the consequences of that moment, let me show you the detail that froze me immediately. The turn aligned perfectly with the object's rotation phase, exactly at the 180-degree mark of its 17-minute cycle. The moment when the narrowest profile faced the sun. A maneuver executed at the precise instant the object presented its smallest cross-sectional area to external forces. That is not chance. That is optimization. The turn was not merely impossible, it was efficient. When I overlaid the rotation phase with the trajectory pivot, the lines fell into perfect sync. 17 minutes. Half turn, directional shift, and the next rotation cycle. Another micro-adjustment. Smaller this time, just 0.12 degrees, but in the same direction, a sequence, a pattern, a controlled reorientation. You do not need to believe in anything extraordinary to feel the gravity of this. You only need to trust physics, because physics was being violated. Let me take you back to the moment the shift was detected across independent observatories. 43 minutes after the turn, a Chilean array confirmed the anomaly. Object deviated from projected path, acceleration inconsistent with solar radiation, cause under review. Minutes later, an Australian station reported the same. Then, curiously, silence. The report stopped. The alerts went dark. Data streams that had been flowing openly the entire week suddenly slowed to a trickle, then dried entirely. Not failure? Not glitch, deliberate reduction. As if someone, somewhere recognized what that turn meant and decided very quickly that the fewer people who knew about it, the better. But they were too late, because the turn had already revealed something profound. The object could resist the sun. At that proximity, solar radiation pressure is fierce. Even at the scale of micronewtons, it shapes dust plumes, sculpts comet tails, influences trajectories. But when the object reoriented, its trajectory flattened, as though its rotation countered the solar push. It didn't resist through thrust. It didn't resist through shielding. It resisted through geometry, as if the object's shape itself interacted with sunlight in a deliberate way, redirecting force, adjusting motion, balancing itself against the solar wind. There is a principle in astrophysics called sail dynamics, the idea that light can push objects if they present enough surface. This object behaved like the opposite. Instead of catching light, it minimized it. Instead of drifting outward, it sliced through the pressure field. And that slicing motion, that knife-like turn, was what allowed it to pivot. Now let me bring you to the moment when suspicion turned into certainty. When we recalculated the gravitational path with the new vector, something alarming appeared. The object was no longer on a pure hyperbolic trajectory. Its path had curved just enough to enter a new corridor, a narrow, specific corridor, one that intersected with Earth's orbital plane 6 weeks into the future. We double-checked, triple-checked, used separate systems, independent software, different gravitational models. Every calculation returned the same answer. The object had angled itself toward the ecliptic, not toward Earth necessarily, but toward the region where Earth will be. That distinction may seem small. It isn't. Objects do not insert themselves into orbital planes without external torque. Objects do not dip into the ecliptic. It would be like watching a stone tossed from a mountaintop bend toward a path at the base, not because gravity drew it there, but because the stone wanted to roll along that path. I will not pretend I understood the implication immediately. None of us did. But something else happened then. Something stranger than the turn itself. The brightness curve shifted. A subtle dimming. Not random, not chaotic. A sharp drop. Exactly at the moment of the vector change. The object seemed to swallow its own light, as if hiding, as if shielding itself. As if the maneuver required concentration or energy or internal reconfiguration. Because when the dimming passed and the brightness rose again, the rotation rate changed. Not much, just a few thousandths of a second per cycle. But enough to tell us something. The maneuver affected its internal state. This is the part where many investigators would retreat into silence. Because once motion becomes intention, and intention becomes maneuver, you are no longer studying a rock, you are studying a behavior. But the universe was not finished. A few minutes after the turn, the radio harmonic spiked again. This time stronger, twice as strong, with a newly emerging subharmonic beneath it, a faint signature repeating every 19 seconds. No natural object emits that rhythm. Not one. To summarize, a turn timed to rotation, a coordinated dimming, a synchronized signal spike, a trajectory insertion into the ecliptic, 4 domains. One event. Either physics is evolving before our eyes, or something inside that object is communicating through its motion. Before we move forward, I want you to sit with this question for a moment. If an object from another star performs a turn no natural body can execute, at the precise moment its narrowest profile faces the sun, synchronizing light, spin, radio, and trajectory, is that still motion? Or is that expression? Is that physics? Or is that language? You don't need to answer. Just let the question settle, like dust in a beam of light. Because the next chapter shows what happened right after the turn, when the object revealed something no one was prepared to see. There are signals you prepare for. And then there are signals that strike like a heartbeat you weren't supposed to hear. What happened next belongs to the second category. It lasted only 2.4 seconds. A flash so brief that half the observatories missed it entirely. A rise so sharp that no known thermal model could produce it. A pulse of heat, not light, not radiation from the sun, not an energetic flare. Heat. Thermal emission from the object itself. It began at 04:19:32 UTC, roughly 13 seconds after the impossible turn. The timing alone was suspicious, but the signature was what turned suspicion into dread. The infrared sensors recorded a sudden spike in the mid-IR band. Clean, narrow emission centered at 11.3 microns. Comets heat up gradually. Asteroids heat up unevenly. Dust clouds heat up diffusely, but this spike wasn't gradual, uneven, or diffuse. It was controlled. A smooth curve rising like a breath drawn in and falling like a breath released. Heat does not behave like that. Not unless the source has boundaries. Not unless the emitter is solid, coherent, organized. When I first saw the curve, I thought it was a transient, a glitch caused by the system resyncing after the vector update. But the timing logs were crystal clear. Sensors normal, optics normal, gain calibration normal. Only the object changed. Let me show you the moment my stomach dropped. The heat signature wasn't spherical, not even close. It radiated from a single line, thin, elongated, the same shape and orientation as the spindle silhouette we reconstructed earlier. Not from the entire body, not from chaotic outgassing, from a stripe. A segment. A band wrapped around one side of the object. A heated seam. Seams do not occur in naturally formed bodies, not in comets, not in asteroids, not in interstellar debris. A seam implies boundary. Boundary implies separation. Separation implies structure, and structure implies it's something we are not ready to define. Before I could even process this, the shape rotated. Exactly at the 180-degree mark of its cycle, the same point that triggered the turn, the seam swung into the sun-facing position, and in that instant, a second thermal spike emerged. Fainter, shorter, but unmistakable. 2 heat pulses, both perfectly aligned with rotation, both emerging at the moments when the narrowest profile pointed at the sun. This wasn't random. This wasn't chaos. This was choreography. The object reacted to sunlight not by heating uniformly, but by heating along a controlled band, as if something inside that seam absorbed energy, processed it, and released it. The pattern called to mind something uncomfortably specific, not mechanical necessarily, but adaptive, like a biological structure adjusting to temperature, or a material that reacts to illumination, or something with the ability to regulate. Exposure. I refuse to make claims we cannot support. But the implications were hard to ignore. Let me show you the detail that elevated the anomaly from strange to historic. When the heat spikes were plotted against the earlier radio harmonics, Another alignment appeared. Each thermal pulse lined up exactly with a radio subharmonic. Not loosely, not broadly, perfectly. 2 heat pulses, 2 subharmonics, a 1-to-1 correspondence. 5 independent observatories confirmed the timing. 3 arrays confirmed the frequency. Not one could offer an explanation, so we tried to reverse model the cause. We fed the heat curves into rotational dynamics tests. No solution. We tried to generate the signature from internal cracking, but cracks emit randomly, chaotically, asymmetrically. This was none of those. Finally, we tested for thermal stress from solar heating, but the spike happened too fast. Too clean, too synchronized. To produce a spike that perfect in 2.4 seconds, the material would need to possess high thermal conductivity, low inertia, and internal channeling mechanisms. Nothing naturally occurring behaves like that. Nothing. And that's when an older researcher, one who had been silent all night, leaned forward and whispered something that sent a chill along my spine. Heat like this usually means one thing: a release. I asked him what he meant. A system stabilizing itself. A structure equalizing its internal load. A shell adjusting to new stress. Stress from what? He didn't answer. But I knew. The turn. The impossible physics-breaking maneuver would have placed enormous strain on any coherent structure, even a manufactured one, especially a manufactured one. As the room absorbed this implication, something else surfaced. One of the junior astronomers pointed out that the infrared spike wasn't uniform across the band. It had a central dip, a V-shaped trough carved into the peak, as if 2 competing emissions overlapped and interfered. Interference patterns do not occur in simple heat events. They occur in systems with layers, surfaces, internal components, or something carried inside the object responding differently than its exterior. That's when the atmosphere in the control room changed. No one said the word. No one needed to. The data had crossed from impossible to unexplainable. The object didn't just turn. It adjusted. It stabilized. It released heat. And then, most unnerving of all, it cooled too fast. Within 6 seconds, the thermal signature dropped below cometary expectations. Then below asteroid norms. Then below blackbody radiative cooling rates. As if the object wasn't just cooling, but absorbing its own excess heat, removing it, redirecting it, containing it. Nature does not cool like that. Not at that speed, not in that shape, not in that sequence. Before we proceed, I want you to ask yourself something simple but unavoidable. If an object from another star can turn, emit, heat, stabilize, cool too fast, react to sunlight, and synchronize its emissions with rotation, what exactly is natural about it? What definition remains? Do we cling to old terms out of comfort, or because we're afraid to ask the question beneath them? You don't need to answer, just let the question settle. Because what happened next was even stranger. As the object cooled, as the thermal band dimmed, as the rotation returned to its impossible steadiness, something faint appeared on the infrared images, a dark line. Not a seam, not a shadow, a fracture. A crack running across the surface of the object, except this crack didn't emanate heat, it absorbed it, perfectly, like a slit waiting to open. This wasn't damage, this wasn't stress, it looked like a mechanism. But the truth of that crack, what emerged from it, belongs to the next chapter. There are moments in astronomy that feel like observation. And then there are moments that feel like witnessing. What happened next fell firmly into the second category. The crack we detected on the infrared overlay, that thin, cold line absorbing heat instead of releasing it, should have been nothing more than a shadow, a cosmetic artifact on the surface of a distant body. But at 04:20:19 UTC, less than a minute after the second thermal pulse faded, the line deepened. Not visually at first. Not in any way you could show to a casual observer. It deepened in the data. The absorption sharpness increased. The trough in the infrared band widened by a fraction of a micron. The spectral response dipped in a way no natural fissure ever would. Cracks scatter heat. They don't trap it, and they certainly don't deepen on cue. This one responded as if something behind it was pulling energy inward. I remember leaning closer to the monitor, the room behind me fading into a hush. There's a special kind of silence that takes over when a group of scientists stop being analysts and become witnesses. That was the silence we entered. I want you to imagine this clearly. The object, still cold, still dark, still rotating with impossible regularity, carried a slit on its surface that behaved like an opening lung. Each cycle of rotation brought the slit into solar alignment, and with each alignment the absorption intensified, like it was tasting the light. At 04:20:54 UTC, the absorption curve spiked. The room snapped awake. A junior researcher shouted, "There, look at the spectral dip, it's widening." And then the cameras caught it, not in visible light, not in high-resolution optical imagery, but in the enhanced infrared composite, a hinge, a dark structure at the edge of the slit, a contour that moved, barely, subtly, but undeniably. I need you to appreciate the gravity of that single detail. If a hinge exists, then two surfaces meet. If two surfaces meet, then something inside is separate from the exterior. And if something is separate from the exterior, we are no longer observing a uniform body. We are observing an assembly. The slit widened by 0.7%. The hinge contour deepened. Energy absorption intensified, and then the object did something that forced everyone in that room to question everything they thought they understood about motion. It paused. Not entirely. Not in the sense of halting its glide through space. But the rotation, the flawless, unnatural, perfectly linear rotation, hesitated. Its speed dropped, only by 0.14%. But enough to register on the auto-tracking logs. Natural bodies do not adjust rotation to compensate for structural movement. They break. Shatter, erupt. This one adapted, as if accounting for internal rearrangement. The slit expanded again. Less than before, but in a way that showed intent. The infrared cameras caught a thin, sharp line of cold, colder than the background of space. A V-shaped attenuation whose symmetry could not be random. Something inside was absorbing heat too open that slit wider. And then, for the first time since its emergence from behind the sun, the object released something new. A whisper. A narrow band dip at 10.2 microns, a region normally associated with silicate emission from dust grains. Only this wasn't emission. It was suppression. A tiny surgical removal of energy, as though the slit swallowed a fraction of the incoming radiation and let out nothing in return. Someone in the room muttered, "That's impossible." But the older scientist, the same one who whispered about stabilization, didn't look surprised. He only said, "It's opening." The words felt heavy, as if spoken across a great distance. I checked the logs again. 3:14 UTC, no slit visible. 04:19 UTC. Slit appears as a cold line. 04:20 UTC. Heat pulses a line. 04:20:54. Slit begins to widen. 04:21. Rotation hesitates. And then 04:21:09 UTC. A second structure appeared. Not a hinge. Not the slit. Something deeper. A shadow inside the opening. A darker shape nested within the darkness of the slit, absorbing nearly all infrared, like a cavity that did not want to be measured. It felt intentional. Not a chamber, not a void, not a crack, a waiting place, as if something inside expected light after a very long time in darkness. The rotation steadied. The wobble vanished. The slit held open at exactly 1.4% of the surface radius, enough to register, not enough to define. Then the anomaly deepened. Every wavelength from 3 to 15 microns dipped simultaneously, a synchronized absorption event that lasted 1.1 seconds. A breath, a draw inward, a taking. The sensation was visceral, like watching something inhale. One of the infrared specialists broke the silence. If that slit opens fully, we're going to see what's been hidden inside. But no one moved. No one spoke. No one dared to break the fragile quiet that had descended across the control room. Because at that moment, we crossed an invisible boundary. Before the slit, we could pretend the object was natural. After the slit, all pretenses fell away. Even if the structure was not mechanical, even if it was not created, it was organized, and organization implies purpose. The slit widened again, 0.3%. Then stopped. The shadow inside shifted, barely visible, like the outline of something curved but segmented. It wasn't a chamber, it wasn't a void, it was a compartment, a place meant to hold something. But here's the most frightening part. The slit didn't open to release anything. It opened to reveal nothing. A perfect emptiness. An absence so complete it looked active. As though whatever had once occupied that compartment was no longer there, or no longer needed to be. Ask yourself, what is more unsettling? A structure opening to deploy something, or a structure opening to show you it is already gone? We tried modeling the slit's geometry. The angles were wrong. The edges were too clean, the shadows too deliberate. The older researcher finally said the line that has haunted me since, "You don't carve a compartment unless something was meant to fit inside it." The implication pressed against us like a weight. If there was an interior module, where is it? When did it leave? Did it detach during the perihelion passage, the same passage where the first images vanished? Was the heat pulse a residue of its escape? Was the impossible turn the final correction made after separation? Or did the object open because it sensed something, an alignment? A threshold of sunlight? A resonance in the radio spectrum? No one knew. But we had reached a point where every model failed. Natural structures do not possess empty compartments that open on heat triggers. Natural motion does not slow rotation to accommodate internal stress. Natural materials do not generate synchronized thermal dips, and natural interstellar bodies do not adjust themselves to the sun. Let me leave you with one final detail from the infrared logs. It was small. Insignificant to anyone but us. When the slit reached peak openness, for exactly 0.12 seconds, the interior shadow brightened by a fraction. Not from emission, from reflection. A thin arc of reflected sunlight flickered from the inner surface, like polished material catching the light for the first time in millions of years. What kind of interior shines after such a long journey? Where did the thing that once fit inside that compartment go? And why did the slit open now? The answer, or the next clue, came from an unexpected source. A faint, nearly lost harmonic, recorded by a single receiver during the opening event. Not a message, not a signal, a tremor, a vibration, as though something inside the object shifted. But the truth of that vibration, what it meant, what it hinted at, belongs to the next chapter. There are signals you expect from distant objects. Light curves, dust trails, ion tails, radiation echoes. These are familiar patterns, the quiet language of lifeless things drifting through space. But what surfaced next was not quiet, and it was not lifeless. It began at 04:21:11 UTC, a moment so brief most systems ignored it, all but one. A lone sensor in the array caught something internal. A tremor, buried not in the surrounding space, but inside the object itself. A vibration, not seismic, not rotational jitter, not thermal flexure, something deeper. The signal lasted 0.004 seconds, shorter than the blink of an eye, yet sharp enough to carve a perfect imprint across the low-frequency bandwidth. It wasn't noise. Noise is messy. Noise spreads. This vibration was narrow, precise, like a single pluck of a taut string, a resonance. We replayed the data, slowed it, filtered it, separated background from signal. The line sharpened, a curve shaped like the harmonic signature of a struck surface, except nothing struck the object. Nothing touched it, nothing approached it. The vibration came from within. The older researcher, the one who kept warning us quietly throughout the night, was the first to speak. "Something moved," he said. No one argued, because the data spoke for itself. Even natural bodies creak, but they creak with heat, with cracks, with pressure. Their vibrations scatter across frequencies. Chaotic, uneven, sloppy. This vibration was none of those. It had a fundamental frequency, a dominant harmonic, and two faint overtones. That trifecta can only come from a structure with defined boundaries, something hollowed, something chambered, something that responds like an instrument. We plotted the resonance against the model of the slit. The fit was too clean, the The vibration originated from the compartment, the empty compartment. The slit that had opened, not to release something, but to reveal absence, was not silent. Absence is not supposed to vibrate. Whatever moved inside that space left a signature as deliberate as a footprint. We searched the frame-by-frame logs right before and right after the event, and the rotation told a story. 3 micro-oscillations, each only 0.02 degrees, each perfectly timed with the resonance peak, like the object braced itself, as if something shifted inside and the entire structure adjusted to accommodate weight, except there was no mass change. No alteration in trajectory, no dust release, no evidence of impact or detachment, only motion. Inside, nothing. I want you to hold that contradiction, movement inside emptiness, because it became the puzzle that none of us could look away from. At 04:21:12 UTC, 1 second later, the slit closed slightly. Not fully, just enough to tighten, to grip. A narrowing by 0.2%, a mechanical reaction to an internal shift that no one witnessed and no instrument captured. The infrared signature showed a faint warming along the inner edge of the slit, not from sunlight, but from friction. Friction inside a vacuum is not normal. Friction where no mass should be is impossible. But it happened. The shadow within the compartment trembled. A subtle shimmer, barely measurable, yet unmistakable when enhanced. Something stirred. When we amplified the vibration recording by a factor of 10,000, a secondary structure emerged. A second tremor, low, almost subliminal. Faint enough to miss on first pass, a repeating oscillation every 0.61 seconds, rhythmic, stable, consistent, like a heartbeat. I don't mean biological, we cannot leap to that, but the pattern was steady, cyclical, controlled. Natural processes do not produce cycles that regular inside hollow cavities of interstellar objects. One of the radio specialists whispered, "That's a feedback loop, something is regulating itself." Another researcher added, "Regulation implies function, and function implies purpose." At this point, the tension in the room shifted from scientific curiosity to something heavier. No one dared ask the obvious question, so I did. If something moved, is it still moving? The older researcher leaned forward, finger hovering over the timeline. "Look at the tail end of the resonance." We zoomed in. Then we saw it. For 0.002 seconds, so quick you'd overlook it unless searching with intention, the slit emitted a pulse. Not heat, not light, not radio. A pressure wave, a tiny modulation in the surrounding solar wind, like the object exhaled. But solar wind doesn't carry pressure waves. Space doesn't ripple from hollowed shells. The only explanation was that the object briefly expelled particles, but the detectors recorded nothing. No ions, no dust, no charge. Whatever left the slit, if anything left at all, left without leaving a trace. A perfect disturbance with no debris, a ghosting effect. By now, you may be imagining mechanisms, devices, structures, but the truth is broader and far more unsettling. Because when we compared the vibration signature to known resonance profiles of natural bodies in our own system, we found no analog. None. We compared it to asteroid quakes, to melting cores, to sublimation vents, to collapsing voids. Nothing matched. But when we compared it to resonance profiles of ice shells cracking above subsurface oceans, like Europa, like Enceladus, the similarity was uncomfortable. Not exact, not definite, but evocative, an inner layer shifting against an outer shell. As if something inside was not fixed, not bonded, not dead. Before anyone could speculate further, another anomaly surfaced. At 04:21:14 UTC, 3 seconds after the vibration, the radio harmonics dropped into silence. The object, which had been emitting faint subharmonics for hours, went quiet. Not weak. Not faded. Silent. A flat line. A void. The kind of silence that feels intentional. A silence shaped like a held breath. The room sank into stillness with it. If the harmonics were random, their sudden disappearance would not mean anything. But harmonics that vanish 3 seconds after an internal tremor and a narrowing slit, that silence carries weight. One of the analysts finally whispered what we were all thinking. "It's listening." Another said, "Or waiting." And I considered a third possibility. What if it's responding? The older researcher turned to me, eyes hollow. Responding to what? We all stared at the screen. At the object drifting silently through space. At the slit barely open. At the compartment that shouldn't be empty. At the vibration that had no source. At the silence. This was no longer the quiet of interstellar debris. This was the quiet of something that shifted and then became still again. A silence that felt aware. I don't mean conscious, I mean sensitive, reactive, poised. Objects do not wait, objects do not regulate, objects do not tighten compartments after internal movement, but this one did. Before we leave this chapter, there is one last detail, the kind you overlook until you realize it is the most important part of all. At the exact moment the harmonics flatlined, the slit's interior shadow deepened. Not because it grew darker, but because the interior shape moved backward, retreated. Something inside pulled away from the opening, as if it sensed exposure, as if it sensed us. Where did it go? What withdrew deeper into that unseen space? And why did it recoil the moment our instruments detected the vibration? Those answers lie not in what we saw, but in what disappeared next. There is a particular fear that comes not from what appears, but from what disappears. Up to this point, every anomaly we documented, the impossible turn, the synchronized heat pulses, the opening slit, the internal vibration, shared one trait. Something revealed itself. A line, a seam, a tremor, a shadow. But what happened next reversed the pattern. This wasn't revelation. This was subtraction. Erasure. Loss. It began at 04:21:17 UTC. 3 seconds after the harmonics flatlined, 2 seconds after the interior shape retreated, 1 second after the slit tightened, a moment so subtle only a long exposure composite caught it first. The core vanished, not the entire object, that would have been impossible to miss, not the shell. Its rotation remained steady, its silhouette unchanged. The disappearance happened inside. The cavity, the compartment that opened, the slit that revealed emptiness, registered one more anomaly before collapsing into silence. Its internal heat signature blinked out, not dimmed, not cooled, disappeared. A total thermal erasure from the center of the object. No residual warmth, no gradient, no lingering signature. The interior went from measurable to undetectable in less than 0.3 seconds. I remember staring at the heat map, waiting for the sensors to refresh, waiting for the usual afterglow all materials produce. Even the coldest ice retains echoes of energy, but the cavity returned nothing, a perfect zero. A void so absolute it looked artificial. Something inside the object, something we never fully saw, had gone. But gone where? Inside? Outside? Through the slit? Into the surrounding space? Or did it simply stop existing in any way our instruments could detect? The questions piled faster than the data. We reran the scans, checked calibration, searched for shadows or density shifts. Nothing. The cavity wasn't empty. It had become unreadable. A senior analyst whispered, "Is it cloaked?" Another said, "No, the slit didn't release anything." But the older researcher, the man who'd seen the pattern before any of us, shook his head slowly. "Not cloaked," he said. "Withdrawn." Withdrawn. The word hit like cold stone. Objects withdraw. Creatures retreat. Systems shut down. But cores? Cores do not vanish. We checked gravitational readings, tiny measurements sensitive enough to detect irregular density distribution. No change. The object's total mass remained the same, but mass does not simply move without shifting the center of gravity, unless the movement was internal, compensated for. Stabilized, unless the object actively redistributed load to hide the absence, which implied awareness, not in a conscious sense, but in the sense of a system responding to change, a system designed to maintain balance. I looked over the data again. 3 tremors, a narrowing slit, a retreating shadow, a vanishing thermal signature. It lined up too perfectly. 042111, vibration detected. 042112, slit tightens. 042114, harmonics vanish. 042117, core disappears. A sequence, a chain, as if each step triggered the next. Someone in the room murmured, "We didn't witness chaos, we witnessed procedure." Procedure. Another forbidden word in natural science. The older researcher leaned back, eyes fixed on the monitor. "This reminds me of 1982, he said. Everyone stiffened. The classified case, the one with an object that appeared for 5 hours, spun impossibly, and then vanished from sensors altogether. I asked him quietly, "What did the core do back then?" He answered just as quietly, "It withdrew." Just like this. A chill traveled through the room. I pressed him. "What do you mean, withdrew? Where did it go?" "It ceased reflecting, ceased radiating, ceased vibrating. It became nothing measurable. And then? It left its shell." Silence. Heavy, suffocating, electric. He continued. "The outer structure drifted for hours, empty, hollow, a husk, like a chrysalis after emergence. A husk. The word hung in the air. Was that what we were watching now? A shell just beginning to reveal its emptiness? I turned back to the monitor. The slit on our object remained open, not fully, not inviting, but ajar. A fraction wide, a door that had already been used, a door waiting to close. We zoomed in, frame by frame, nanometer by nanometer. There was no sign of an ejected body, no debris cloud, no signature of expelled mass. But one thing had changed. The inner cavity no longer absorbed light. It reflected nothing, emitted nothing, chilled nothing. It wasn't a hollow. It was absence. A shape missing from space, a gap not filled by darkness, but by a lack of response, like a mouth that once held breath, now sealed shut. The younger researchers panicked quietly, trying to frame the anomaly in terms of known physics. Maybe it was a volatile pocket. No pockets don't vanish cold. Maybe it melted. No melt curve observed. Maybe it sublimated. And I stepped in. Sublimation releases particles. We detected none. They fell silent. Because the truth was not chemical. It was structural. This wasn't a process happening to the object. It was a process happening inside it, a process that removed something intentionally, cleanly, quietly. But what? And more importantly, where did it go? We checked the surrounding space for disturbances, small eddies, interference patterns, solar wind irregularities. Nothing. It was like a hand removing itself from sand without leaving a print. The older researcher's voice broke through the uncertainty. "Look at the rotation." We did, and the blood in my veins ran cold. The rotation, which had hesitated slightly during the slit's opening, now corrected itself. Precisely. Elegantly. Mathematically immaculate, the absence of the core made the object more stable, not less. As though the core had been ballast, or payload. A mass no longer needed, no longer present. The object felt lighter, freer, relieved, designed. A natural body does not improve function after losing its core. A designed structure might. Someone whispered, "So what now?" Does it drift? Open again? Break apart? The older researcher answered, "No. It will continue its path. That's what they do." "They?" I asked. He didn't respond. We returned to the monitor. The object drifted on, silent, calculating, balanced. But one final detail emerged, one so subtle we almost dismissed it. The exterior shell, for the first time since emergence, gained warmth, a faint glow along its northern ridge, a soft infrared shimmer, weak, transient, like the cooling of something recently emptied, like a chrysalis still warm from whatever left it. Ask yourself something, not as a scientist, but as someone who feels the weight of the unknown. If the core is gone, if the shell remains, and if the slit opened not to release but to reveal, where is the thing that once occupied the center of this object? Is it still inside, hidden deeper? Did it exit without detection? Did it dissolve into a state we cannot measure? Or did it activate a phase our instruments are not designed to see? The truth waited in the next anomaly, because minutes later, as the shell drifted in its impossible stability, a new signature appeared. Not heat, not rotation, not radio. A brightening, a soft, impossible glow from the empty cavity. But this time the cavity wasn't reflecting the sun, it was emitting. Light is supposed to behave. It reflects. It scatters. It bends through gravity, weakens with distance, and obeys the simple rules written into the fabric of physics itself. But what appeared inside the hollow of that drifting shell did not behave, and it did not obey. It emerged at 04:21:43 UTC, 26 seconds after the core vanished. At first, it seemed like a sensor glitch. A single pixel brightened along the interior boundary of the cavity, too faint to classify, too brief to interpret. But then it grew. Not outward, like a spark expanding. Not inward, like a flare collapsing. It grew sideways. A ribbon of light, a thin band that stretched across the interior curve, not illuminating the space but outlining it, as if tracing a shape we were never meant to see. I remember the moment vividly. A researcher gasped behind me. Another stepped back from the screen. Someone started praying quietly under their breath. Because the light didn't behave like any known emission. It had no spread, no diffusion, no photons escaping into space. It stayed confined as though the cavity itself was holding it in place, a cage of radiance. The older scientist leaned closer, eyes wide. "That's not emission," he whispered. "That's activation." The word settled heavily. Activation. As if something inside the cavity, something hidden, dormant, waiting, had finally been triggered. But triggered by what? The turn, the vibration, the vanishing core, the alignment with the sun, the opening slit? Or us? Because as the light grew stronger, it began to pulse. Slow at first, a soft glow rising and falling like the breath of something colossal. Then faster, sharper, more deliberate. 6 pulses, evenly spaced, measurable. Chemical reactions don't pulse cleanly. Cracks don't emit rhythmic light. Thermal gradients don't organize themselves into rules. This light obeyed a rule we did not understand. At 04:21:47 UTC, the pulse sequence changed. 6 pulses, pause. 3 pulses, pause. 1 long flare, then darkness. A pattern, not random, not noisy, not natural. We ran it through every spectral model, every chemical signature, every known transient. Nothing matched. Light does not encode. Not like that. For a long moment, no one spoke. Everyone in the room seemed afraid of the thought forming behind their eyes. The younger analysts whispered possibilities. Could it be a reflection from the shell? No angle matches. A solar particle hit? No trajectory. A glitch? 6 independent sensors confirmed it. The older researcher finally broke the silence. It's a response. My throat tightened. A response to what? To whatever left the core empty. He pointed at the cavity. That light isn't leaking out. It's contained. It's deliberate. It's shaping itself against the walls. Shaping. That word chilled me. Because the cavity, the empty compartment once holding something we never saw, was now glowing along its entire curvature, outlining a geometry far too smooth and far too symmetrical to be natural stone or ice. We enhanced the shape. A curve, a fold, a contour that wrapped around the entire interior like the inner shell of a seed. But it wasn't a sphere or a tube or a simple hollow. It was complex, layered, segmented, like ribs, like scaffolding, like the imprint of something that once sat perfectly aligned inside. A shape built to cradle something, and yet that something was gone. The cavity glowed again, not bright, but sharp. Thin filaments of light traced along the interior like veins illuminated from within. 1 filament, 2, 4, 12. They flickered, then stabilized. The structure of the cavity was revealing itself. A honeycomb pattern, but irregular. Organic in arrangement, precise in spacing, not crystalline, not geological, not random. Imagine a nest long abandoned whose walls still remember the shape of the creature that built it. That is what the cavity resembled. A memory carved into matter. Suddenly, a narrow harmonic tremor broke the silence. The first harmonic since the core vanished. But instead of a frequency spike, this one rose as a whisper. Soft. Barely there, 0.07 Hz, a frequency so low you don't hear it, you feel it. A tremor that vibrated the instruments, the walls, your chest, as though something deep inside the object, not mass but intention, had awakened. The light reacted instantly. The filaments flexed. The glow tightened, the pattern contracted, then the entire cavity brightened for 0.8 seconds. A single, perfect burst, like a lantern igniting inside a sealed chamber, and then the filaments went dark. The glow collapsed, the cavity dimmed. Everything fell silent. The light was gone, erased, as though a hand had closed over a candle. A researcher whispered, "What did we just see?" The older scientist didn't answer. He stared at the screen as if looking through it, past the shell, into something far older than our instruments could grasp. Finally, he spoke. That wasn't light, that was memory. I asked him what he meant. He held up the spectral graph. Look, the cavity didn't emit energy. It echoed it. And then I saw it. The pulse pattern wasn't output. It was feedback. The cavity responded to the tremor that came from within it, like a bell chiming after being struck by something long gone. Light as residual memory. Light as imprint. Light as shadow of a presence that was no longer there. But the part that unsettled me most wasn't the glow. Wasn't the pulses. Wasn't the cavity shaping itself around absence. It was what happened afterward. The slit, the opening we thought had finished its cycle, shifted. Not opened, not widened, shifted. A tiny tilt, 0.3 degrees, as though the outer shell was adjusting its orientation to protect the cavity, to hide it. From us. Ask yourself, if the light was memory, what memory? Of what presence? Of what process? Of what departure? And if something left that cavity recently enough for the walls to still resonate, where did it go? Into space? Into a state we cannot detect? Or deeper into the object itself, beyond the shell, beyond the slit, into a place our instruments cannot reach? The next anomaly answered that, because minutes after the light faded, a new signature appeared, one no one expected, one we thought impossible. The shell began to thin. You expect an object in space to behave like a thing, solid, silent, unchanging. You expect a shell to be a shell, a boundary, a surface, a certainty. But 49 seconds after the light inside that hollow cavity collapsed into darkness, the shell did something no object of stone, ice, or metal coal, or dust has ever done. It began to thin. Not brighten, not dim, not crack. It thinned, subtly at first, like mist forming along the edges of a shape, like something losing density without losing form. The first indicator was a drop in albedo, so slight that only the enhanced feed caught it. The object's silhouette, once clean against the star field, softened, not by erosion, not by dust shedding, but by transparency. Transparency is not a word astronomers use lightly. Nothing in interstellar space becomes transparent. Even gas clouds scatter. Even dust shines. Even ice refracts. But the shell of this object, still rotating with its impossible steadiness, began passing light through its edges. It wasn't vanishing, at least not in the way something evaporates. It was becoming less matter, more outline, like the ghost of a structure trying to remember its own shape. The older researcher noticed it first. He leaned in and said, barely above a whisper, "It's losing coherence." We waited for the second half of the sentence, the logical explanation, the grounding thought, but none came. Losing coherence is what happens to plasma when magnetic confinement fails. It is what happens to holographic projections when signal strength collapses. It is what happens to simulations when the underlying data is withdrawn. But it is not what happens to physical objects drifting through real space, and yet the shell kept thinning. The readings confirmed it. Density loss of 0.4%, then 0.9%, then 1.6%, not uniform, focused along the northern arc, the same region that warmed faintly after the core vanished. You would think density loss would destabilize rotation, but no. The object remained perfectly balanced, as if guided by something deeper than mass distribution. We enhanced the image. The shell wasn't dissolving, it was transitioning. Light slipped through its framework in a pattern, first revealing faint interior ribs, then membranes stretched like filaments, then the curved imprint of the cavity walls, now empty and dim. The structure inside looked less structural and more skeletal. Not biological, not machine, something between, something that responded to energy instead of obeying it. What is holding it together? One of the analysts asked. Not a rhetorical question, a genuine plea, because the shell, now visibly translucent near its ridge, remained intact. Its edges glowed faintly as starlight passed through its outermost layer. The glow was not reflection. It was delay. A fraction of a microsecond where light slowed, bent, hesitated. Fields can do that. Fields shaped around structure. Fields that hold memory of form even when the form itself weakens. It's not fading, the older researcher murmured. It's shedding. Like a skin? Someone asked. No, he said. Like a boundary. A boundary implies interiority. Something inside, something the shell once protected, something no longer there. Which raised the question none of us wanted to voice. If the shell is shedding, what stage comes after? The thinning accelerated. The shell's northern arc became almost diaphanous. You could see stars through it, faint, blurred by whatever material or field lingered, but unmistakably visible. The shell was no longer simply losing density, it was becoming permeable. We checked temperature, zero change. We checked mass, no measurable drop. We checked reflectivity, halved. We checked emissivity, collapsing. It was like watching a chrysalis after emergence, still shaped like purpose, but hollowed, dimming, dissolving slowly into the medium around it. A trembling hum emerged. Not radio, not vibration, but a faint modulation across the solar wind. A ripple pattern, almost musical, almost structured, almost like the dying note of something unsupported. The shell responded. Thin ridges along its length shimmered, then relaxed, like tendons unclenching, like a scaffold settling after weight is lifted. What if the shell isn't failing? Someone whispered. What if it's completing its cycle? The older researcher didn't disagree. He only said, "Look at the horizon." We zoomed. And there it was. A faint glow emerging along the inner surface, not from the cavity this time, but from the outer shell itself. Thin lines of luminescence tracing ancient paths like constellations etched onto the surface. The light followed patterns, loops, intersections, spirals, like circuitry worn down by ages. Each flicker corresponded to structural loss, like the last impulses of a dying nervous system. Then something changed. The rotation slowed, only by an infinitesimal margin, but for this object, even that was seismic. The shell shifted orientation, slightly but deliberately. It angled itself away from the sun, away from us, as if shielding its fading parts, or hiding them. And then the impossible happened. The thinning stopped, stabilized at 14% translucency. The glow paused. The ripples quieted. For the first time since the core vanished, the object held perfectly still in its condition. Not motionless, still rotating, still drifting, but stable. A plateau. A breath. Then the brightness curve dipped. Not the dramatic drop of a thermal pulse. A quiet dimming. A sigh. What does it mean? A researcher asked. I answered before thinking, it's conserving. The older scientist nodded slowly. Yes, something is preparing. For what? The question pressed into the room like weight. Because objects don't prepare. Systems do. Mechanisms do. Life does. The shell's translucency allowed us to see something we had never seen before. The inner lattice. Thin, fibrous structures connecting the outer layer to a deeper ring, once anchored to the core, now hanging slack. Those fibers began vibrating gently, as if adjusting tension. A mechanical system doesn't do that on its own. A decaying system doesn't do it either. This was adaptive. We zoomed again. The inner ring brightened, faintly, like a pupil reacting to light, then dimmed, like testing sensitivity, then brightened again, stronger, clearer, more deliberate. The shell responded, all at once. Its translucency deepened, not to vanish, but to reveal. A new structure underneath, something the shell had been concealing, something we had not yet understood. Thin arches, symmetrical reinforcement lines, a circular frame beneath the surface, a second shell hidden within the first, not fading, emerging. The older researcher whispered, "It's not dying, it's transitioning." He swallowed. "It's shedding what's no longer needed." I felt my chest tighten. Because if the outer shell was a chrysalis, then the thing beneath it, the thing we were just beginning to glimpse, was the next stage, the next form, the next function, and the cavity, the light, the vanished core, all of it led to this moment, the revelation of the second shell. But the true shock was not its emergence. It was what the second shell began to do, something no natural object could ever perform. It began to unfold. There are moments in an investigation when the universe stops being distant and instead leans toward you, quietly, slowly, as if testing whether you're ready to see what has always been there. The unfolding began at 04:22:09 UTC, not with a flare, not with a crack, not with any gesture that belongs to natural bodies drifting through interstellar dark. It began with a soft shiver along the inner lattice, barely perceptible, like tension awakening in the fibers of a structure that had been waiting for the right moment. The translucency of the outer shell, now stabilized at its impossible thinness, allowed us to see it clearly. The second shell, the hidden layer, the structure concealed inside the hollow of the fading cocoon, moved. Not rotating, not vibrating, moving, shifting its geometry in a deliberate sequence. We zoomed in. The inner ring, once static and dim, began to elongate, not stretch. Elongate, its curvature adjusting as if it were soft, adaptive. Then the first arch lifted, a slender crescent-like rib rising from the surface, slow and controlled, like the wingbone of something ancient unfolding after a long sleep. The older researcher exhaled, sharply, not in fear, but in recognition. "This is structural reconfiguration," he said, "not decay." His voice trembled on the word reconfiguration, because that word threatened every assumption we had left. Natural bodies fracture, they crumble, they wear away, they do not reconfigure, they do not rearrange their own architecture, they do not open themselves. But this one did. The arch continued rising, its surface shimmering like a material that barely existed, like something caught between states of matter, half solid, half light. Then a second arch rose beside it, and a third, and a fourth, each in perfect sequence, spaced with mathematical precision along the interior circumference. 12 arches total, 12 movements, 12 gestures in a choreography we did not understand. None of them touched the outer shell, yet the fading cocoon seemed to respond. The translucent membrane softened further, as though yielding to the transformation inside. Watching it felt like intruding on a metamorphosis. The younger analysts were whispering again, trying to anchor this to something known. Maybe tectonic motion. No, tectonics behave like synchronized ribs, a collapse. Collapses don't lift structure. Thermal expansion? Expansion isn't coordinated. The older scientists silenced them with a raised hand, and then the next phase began. The arches did not merely rise, they opened. The tips unfurled outward, like petals pulled by invisible forces, revealing thin filaments stretched between them, filaments so fine they looked like threads of condensed starlight. These filaments brightened, a faint glow, steady and cool, a glow that did not radiate outward, but along the fibers themselves, as if carrying information rather than heat. "Is that signaling?" someone whispered. Another answered, "No, it's alignment." And it was. The entire lattice was aligning itself toward something. But what? We checked orientation. At first, we thought it was aligning toward Earth. It wasn't. Then the sun. No. Then the ecliptic plane. Close, but not exact. When we calculated the vectors again, the answer became clear. The structure was orienting toward a region behind the object, a patch of seemingly empty interplanetary space, a direction with no star, no asteroid, no beacon, nothing. Nothing we could see, nothing our instruments registered. Yet the object oriented toward it with devotion, like a needle aligning to a magnetic field we couldn't detect. Then the inner shell shifted again. The filaments tightened, the arches locked into place. The entire structure pulsed once, just once, sending a ripple of light across the inner cavity, not outward, inward, as though preparing something inside or remembering something that used to be there. And then something unbelievable happened. The cavity, empty since the vanishing core, contracted, not physically closing, contracting visually like space inside it. Folded. The filaments reacted by brightening. The arches trembled. A harmonic tremor passed through the solar wind, so low in frequency that it registered as a pressure change rather than sound. 0.04 Hz, the same subsonic frequency recorded during deep ocean seismic events on Earth, not identical, but too similar to ignore. It's compressing the interior, one analyst said. But compressing what? Someone else asked. There's nothing left inside. But that was no longer true. As the cavity folded inward, something flickered at its center. A spark, a reflection, a point of density. We zoomed, enhanced, cleared noise. And there it was, a single point, dark, dense, heavy, emerging in the center of the cavity. Not mass, something worse. Negative contrast, a region darker than the surrounding interior, not by absence of light, but by absorption of everything. The cavity wasn't contracting around emptiness, it was contracting around a seed. Something had condensed, not returned, not revealed, formed. Is that the core reforming? Someone whispered. No, the older scientist said, shaking his head slowly. The core didn't return, it was replaced. Replaced. I felt a coldness in my chest as the arches curving above the cavity snapped into alignment. 12 perfect vectors pointing to the forming seed, as if feeding it, guiding it, building around it. The object wasn't dying. The object wasn't decaying. It was regenerating, transforming, rebuilding from within. The seed pulsed once, an implosive gesture, pulling a fraction of light inward. The arches pulsed with it, a perfect echo. Then again. 6 pulses. 3 pulses, 1 long flicker, the same pattern we saw in the light inside the cavity, the same pattern that echoed after the vibration inside the hollow, the same pattern we mistook for memory. It wasn't memory. It was instruction. A code. And the shell, outer and inner, was obeying it. The translucency deepened to nearly 22%. We could see almost everything now. The arches, the filaments, the seed forming at the center, the shell bending as if preparing for something inevitable. The entire structure vibrated with low-frequency resonance, not violence, not instability, purpose, coordination. Something is coming, a researcher whispered. No, the older scientist said. It's waking. Ask yourself this, not as someone looking at data, but as someone aware of the weight of coincidences collapsing into a single truth. If an object sheds its outer shell, reveals a second shell, opens arches like ribs, tightens filaments like nerves, and forms a seed from the disappearance of its core, is that still physics? Is that still nature? Or are we watching a life cycle, a stage, a rebirth? The final moment of this chapter came when the seed pulsed a last time, louder, deeper, heavier, sending a shock through every sensor. And the inner shell responded with the first unmistakable gesture of intent. It began to rotate, independently, separate from the outer shell, separate from the main body. A second rotation, a second axis, a second life. The object was now 2 bodies in one, and the one inside was waking. There is a kind of silence that comes before revelation. Not the silence of absence, nor the silence of empty space, but the silence of something rearranging itself behind a veil you were never meant to see through. That was the silence that filled the room when the inner shell began to rotate. At first, we thought it was an illusion, artifact, parallax, misalignment between outer and inner frames. But illusions do not carry torque. Illusions do not drag the surrounding solar wind. Illusions do not generate measurable angular momentum. This did. The inner shell, newborn, translucent, ribbed with 12 arches, was rotating at 0.036 radians per second, while the outer shell remained locked in its original spin. 2 rotations, 2 bodies, 2 rhythms, one inside another. Like a hidden heart starting to beat under the ribs of something ancient. The younger analysts panicked first. Internal differential rotation, how is that possible? There's no bearing between shells. It's violating rigid body dynamics. It's violating everything. But the older researcher, the only one who had seen this pattern decades ago in the case no one ever discussed officially, remained still. This is the moment, he murmured, when the inner structure takes sovereignty from the outer one. But sovereignty. A word that did not belong in astronomy. A word that made my stomach tighten. Because sovereignty implies agency. Agency implies function. Function implies intention. The rotation accelerated, not wildly, not chaotically. In increments, calculated, precise, like gears engaging into new positions. 0.036 became 0.048, then 0.00053. Then it stabilized, not at a random number, but at a ratio, a perfect ratio, 117 relative to the outer shell's rotation, 17. The same period we observed in the object's blink cycle. The same period tied to the impossible maneuver. The same period controlling the heat pulses. The same period governing the slit's opening. The second spin was not new. It was the true rhythm, and the outer shell had been following it all along. A mimicry, a mask. A shell acting the way shells do, hiding the organism beneath. The inner structure gleamed faintly as rotation stabilized. The arches curved downward, casting shadows across the forming seed. With each rotation, the seed brightened, absorbing, responding, growing. The cavity that once looked like absence now looked like a womb. Then the first tremor struck, a harmonic ripple not from the seed but from the arches. Each one vibrating in a different tone, 12 distinct frequencies, blending into a single composite wave. The composite wave matched the pulsation sequence from earlier: 6 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, pause, 1 long flare. We stared at the waveform. It's running the same. Code, someone whispered. No, the older researcher said softly, it's executing it. The code was not a remnant, not a memory, not echo. It was an instruction cycle, a sequence the object had been waiting to perform. The seed, that dense point at the cavity's center, responded immediately. It doubled in opacity, tripled in mass shadow. Its gravitational signature deepened, but the mass of the object as a whole did not change. How does gravity increase without adding mass? A question no one wanted to answer. The older man did. By compression, by structuring, by changing state. Then the seed pulsed, hard. A burst of energy so low frequency it registered more as a pressure shift than light. Sensors shook. The floor hummed. A metallic table nearby vibrated imperceptibly. We stared at the readings. A resonance at 0.002 hertz, so deep it felt like something inside your bones acknowledging it. The arches folded. Not fully, just enough to form a chamber around the seed. The inner spin tightened again, faster, cleaner, more aligned. And then the outer shell reacted. For the first time since thinning, it moved voluntarily. Not rotation, not drift, not wobble. It tilted, a 0.8-degree tilt, just enough for the fading membrane to realign with the inner spin. A synchronization gesture, a handshake between shells. What is it doing? It's coordinating its layers. Why? The older researcher finally answered. Because something inside is about to activate. The seed pulsed again. A flash of dark, not bright. Not light, a pulse of density, as if space bent inward for a fraction of a second. And then, the inner shell changed color, not visually. Spectrally, a shift from infrared absorption to near-infrared emission, a wavelength associated with thermal reorganization and phase transitions. The inner shell was heating from the inside out, not randomly. In a pattern, spiraling lines of warmth wrapping around the arches like veins flushing with blood, the outer shell reacted as well. Its thinning paused, its translucency held steady. A faint halo of light shimmered around its ridge, as if protecting the inner structure from external influence. This is metamorphosis, someone whispered. No, the older researcher said. This is ignition. The word landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Ignition. Inside the seed, the gravitational shadow expanded. A swirl, a rotation inside a rotation, the beginnings of a core that was not the old one, not a natural one, but a constructed one. A new center, a new function. Something was being born. I interrupted the silence. What exactly is being ignited? The older man answered without looking away from the screen. Whatever the object has been protecting, whatever it carried across interstellar space, whatever the empty cavity was once meant to hold. The seed pulsed again, a deep, clean resonance. The arches glowed. The inner shell accelerated. The outer shell held its tilt. The object was no longer a visitor. It was an engine, an organism, a vessel, an architecture awakening. As the seed formed its first coherent shape, its shadow sharpened, not spherical, not random, a point, a spike, a needle forming at the center of the cavity. Ask yourself something, not as a skeptic, not as a believer, but as a witness. If something drifts across light years, sheds its shell, reveals a second structure, awakens a seed, and aligns itself to a direction we cannot see, what is it preparing to do? Point to something, pierce something, measure something, communicate with something, or become something we have never encountered before? The answer began forming the moment the seed shaped itself into that needle-like point, a shape no natural physics would select on its own. A shape built for one purpose. There are shapes the universe favors, spheres, spirals, disks, arcs carved by gravity and time. And then there are shapes the universe does not produce on its own, shapes that do not belong to drifting ice, fractured stone, or interstellar debris, shapes that imply intent. Purpose. Design. The needle belonged to the second category. It emerged slowly at first, an elongation in the seed, a darkening at the center of the cavity, a sharpening of density that looked like space bending inward. But within seconds, it became unmistakable, a thin, tapered structure forming along the exact rotational axis of the inner shell. Perfectly centered, perfectly aligned, perfectly wrong. The first thing we noticed was how sharply the needle absorbed light. Even the near-infrared wavelengths bounced off the arches, off the shell, off the membranes, but were swallowed by the needle's tip. It wasn't reflective, it wasn't matte, it wasn't even dark in any familiar sense. It was subtractive. A presence that behaved like an absence. A point around which the cavity reorganized itself. The older researcher froze when he saw it. "No," he whispered. "It's not forming a structure. It's forming a vector. A vector. Not an object, a direction." The arches tightened their curvature. The inner filaments glowed brighter, carrying pulses of faint luminescence toward the seed. The inner shell accelerated its independent rotation, stabilizing at a perfect harmonic with the needle's length. Every subsystem inside the object, if we could even call them subsystems, began orienting itself toward that point. And then the outer shell reacted too. Not through translucency, not through loss, but through alignment. The entire object, outer layer, inner chamber, seed, tilted in a unified gesture as though pointing. But pointing at what? We ran the coordinates. The object wasn't pointing toward Earth, not toward the sun, not toward any planet or asteroid, not toward a star. It pointed toward a region of space that was, as far as our databases could confirm, utterly empty. A patch of sky with no cataloged bodies, no known emissions, no gravitational anomalies, nothing. And yet the needle aligned to it with precision so exact it defied coincidence. "Maybe something passed through that region recently," one analyst said, desperation leaking into her voice. "We checked archival data. No comets, no asteroids, no gamma rays, no background fluctuations." "Could it be a navigational orientation?" another researcher asked. "Like a star tracker?" "Star trackers track stars," I replied. "This is tracking emptiness." The older scientist remained silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that means someone is remembering something they swore they'd never say again. We zoomed further. The needle elongated. 5 meters, 10 meters, 15 meters, scaling perfectly with cavity geometry, its base broad enough to anchor, its tip thin enough to pierce shadow itself. It wasn't forming a tool. It was forming a signal, or worse, a receiver. The needle vibrated slightly, not mechanically, spectrally. A frequency so low that it didn't propagate through space, but through the object's own inner lattice. The arches responded, humming in resonance, like a choir of ribs singing in unison. 12 voices, 12 vibrations, 12 harmonics forming a single beam of intention. "What is it doing?" someone whispered. The answer arrived before any of us could speak. A new reading hit the monitors. Not light, not heat, not radio. A gravitational tremor. Faint, focused. A perturbation not outward but inward, as though space itself were being pulled into the needle. It acted like a gravity lens. A microscopic one, a directed one. "That's impossible," someone said. "Unless it's not a lens," the older researcher replied quietly. "Unless it's a probe." Every head turned. "A probe?" someone asked. "A probe for what?" another whispered. He shook his head. "No, not probing. Searching." "Searching for what?" He exhaled slowly, the weight of decades pressing into a single sentence. "For whatever it lost." The words hit harder than any data point. The cavity was a cradle. The core was something once inside it. The slit opened after the perihelion passage. The thermal pulses resembled a shedding event. The diminishing shell echoed metamorphosis. The seed formed only after the core vanished. The object wasn't breaking down. It was activating a phase that required the absence of whatever had been inside, as if the core leaving triggered its next purpose. The needle pulsed, a deep, inward pull, like a finger pressing into the fabric of space. Then another, then another. The surrounding solar wind shifted. Particles bent toward the cavity, not violently but magnetically, as though the needle were calling them. The inner shell brightened, the filaments glowed, the arches tightened. Everything pointed toward the needle. A pattern emerged along its length, rings, evenly spaced like ribbed segments of an impossible antenna joints of an extending limb. The rings pulsed in perfect sequence. 6, pause, 3, pause, 1. The same pattern, always the same pattern, the pattern that guided the unfolding, the pattern that shaped the metamorphosis. The pattern that now resonated along the needle like the spine of something sensing the dark. And then the object did something none of us were ready for. The needle extended beyond the cavity. It pushed through the inner membrane, then through the thinning outer shell, without damaging either. Like a shadow slipping through a darker shadow. Like a memory pushing into reality. A point emerged, slight at first, then unmistakable, from the object's northern arc. A thin spike, barely visible, yet sharp enough to make the entire room fall silent. It wasn't breaking the shell. It wasn't piercing it. It was phasing through it, matter passing through matter with no resistance, no fracture, no displacement. A property no natural object possesses. The needle pointed toward empty space, that same patch of nothing the object had been aligning to since the unfolding began. The older researcher whispered, fear crawling into his expression for the first time. "It's reaching for something." I asked the only question left. What could possibly exist in that direction? He didn't look away from the screen. "Not something that exists," he said. "Something that answers." And then, as if summoned by the needle's impossible gesture, a ripple appeared in that empty region of space. A distortion. A shimmer. A bend in the background stars. A response. The needle held its aim, trembling with resonance, as if bracing for what came next. There are distortions the universe tolerates, lensing from gravity, scattering from dust, scintillation from solar wind. And then there are distortions the universe does not tolerate. Distortions that have no cause, no mass behind them, no radiation source, no measurable agent. Distortions that appear only when something unseen exerts pressure on the fabric of reality itself. The ripple belonged to the second category. It began as a tremble in the starfield behind the object. Not movement. Movement implies direction. This was displacement. A brief silent shift in the precise geometry of distant starlight, like a sheet of glass flexing when a weight is placed on its center. Every instrument caught it at once. Every monitor glitched, then corrected. Every researcher stopped breathing. The ripple occurred exactly where the needle pointed, not close, not roughly aligned, exactly, which meant one thing. The needle was not pointing at empty space. It was pointing at something that was able to respond. The older researcher's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. He simply stared at the distortion, the first visible sign that whatever existed beyond our detection threshold was not passive. "What caused that?" someone whispered. "We ran simulations." No mass detected, no heat, no magnetic field, no radiation, no gravitational tug. Nothing. The ripple came from nothing and returned to nothing. Except nothing does not ripple. Space does not bend without cause. Light does not shift without influence. Geometry does not distort without force. Run the alignment again, I said. We did. The results were unsettling. The needle was calibrated toward the distortion with a precision of less than 0.01 degrees. Perfect aim, perfect lock, perfect intention. The object wasn't orienting toward the ripple. The ripple was orienting toward the object. The cavity responded. The filaments brightened. The inner shell increased spin by a fractional but deliberate increment. The seed pulsed, once, twice, 3 times, each pulse deeper than the last, as if receiving something. "It's communicating," one analyst murmured. "No," another said. "It's sinking." The word sinking sent a chill through me. Because sinking implies compatibility. Compatibility implies common rules. Common rules imply shared origin, or shared design. A second ripple emerged, larger, smoother, as if something vast but intangible had swept a hand across the surface of the void. The distortion expanded in a perfect ring, like a shockwave with no explosion behind it. The outer shell trembled. Not violently, not chaotically, as though responding to a familiar call. Then the impossible happened. The starfield behind the ripple dimmed, not because a body eclipsed them. There was no silhouette, no outline, no mass. The light simply weakened, as though passing through a region of altered reality, a place where photons lost confidence, where brightness surrendered to an unseen presence. "What are we looking at?" someone whispered. The older researcher finally spoke. "A threshold." We turned toward him. A threshold to what? He swallowed. To wherever the first core went. The implication hit the room like cold metal. The original core, the thing that vanished from the cavity, hadn't simply dissolved or hidden or transformed. It had departed. And now something on the other side was answering the needle's call. The ripple thickened, not visually, but mathematically. Our instruments detected a shear in space-time on the scale of femtometers, ridiculously small, yet orders of magnitude too large to be random. A doorway the size of a molecule is still a doorway, and then the needle reacted. It extended further. Not physically, but spectrally. A frequency burst at 0.002 Hz rippled through the arches. The cavity pulsed. The outer shell shifted. The entire object aligned even more precisely with the distortion. "This is a handshake," one analyst said, voice shaking. "No," the older researcher replied. "It's a retrieval." The distortion tightened. The star field blurred. A darker center formed. Not mass, not shadow, but a place where light refused to exist. A null point. A zero. And from that null point something lifted. Not a body, not an object, not even a shape. A signature. A faint, flickering presence on the threshold of detection, appearing only when illuminated by the needle's own resonance. "What is that?" someone whispered. "It's the return signal," the older scientist said. The signature pulsed, 631. The same sequence, the same pattern, the same code the object had been executing since the slit opened. The code was being answered. The needle responded with a deeper pulse, a call. The distortion answered with a brighter flicker, a reply. "They're talking," someone whispered. The idea that an interstellar object was holding a conversation with something invisible beyond the ripple of distorted starlight should have broken the room. It didn't. It froze it. Then the distortion collapsed inward, like a breath being drawn into the lungs of a thing we couldn't see. The starfield snapped back. The geometry returned. Light behaved again. But something remained. A faint strand. A filament. A cord of near-invisible tension stretching between the needle's tip and the space where the ripple had been. It vibrated. Once, twice, then held still. The older researcher closed his eyes, as if recognizing a truth he had feared for years. "It's bridging," he said. "Bridging to what?" I asked. He opened his eyes. They looked hollow. To its other half. The chapter ends on that thought, because the next anomaly did not come from the ripple or the needle or the void. It came from the outer shell, as it began to break not outward but inward. There's a kind of silence that does not come from stillness, but from the world holding its breath. That was the silence that filled the observation room when the outer shell began to fold. Not crack, not tear, fold, as if space around it had given the structure permission to reverse its own geometry. At first, the motion was barely noticeable, a soft depression forming along the equatorial line, like a bubble dimpled by an unseen fingertip. The membrane did not break, no material flaked, no stress fractures appeared. Instead, the shell behaved like a sheet remembering an older shape, pulling inward, curling toward a center it once concealed. "It's collapsing," someone murmured. "No," the older researcher said, voice hushed. "It's returning." The question that none of us dared ask hovered in the air. Returning to what? The shell continued folding, sections sinking inward in symmetrical waves, as though obeying a choreography written long before it ever entered our solar system. Every curvature aligned with the needle's vector, every contour deepened in the same direction, toward the fading remnant of the ripple. The arches shuddered in response, not violently, but with the trembling precision of something recalibrating. The cavity dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again, as if its own internal light were being siphoned into a single point at the center. Then the readings changed. Thermal signatures dropped. Not slightly, abruptly, as if the object's temperature were no longer governed by solar radiation at all. "What's happening to its heat profile?" an analyst asked. "It's disconnecting from our environment," the older researcher said. "It's removing itself from local physics." That should have been impossible. Nothing disconnects from local physics. Object, energy, space, they obey the same rules everywhere. Unless the rules inside the object were never our rules to begin with. A low vibration passed through the room, subtle but unmistakable. The instruments picked it up as a harmonic resonance originating from inside the collapsing shell. The needle brightened. Not with light, with density. Its readings spiked into the realm of exotic matter signatures, the same category that appears around theoretical models of negative mass or space-time shearing. No object composed of normal material should behave this way. But the needle wasn't acting as matter at all. It behaved like an anchor, pinning the structure not to space, but to the ripple that had vanished moments before. And the collapse accelerated. The membrane spiraled inward now, folding in a tightening helix. The arches buckled inward, following perfect ratios. The cavity shrank by meters in seconds while maintaining symmetry to a degree nature simply does not produce. "This isn't degradation," someone said. "It's transformation." "No," the older researcher corrected. "It's preparation." A new reading hit our screens. Mass change, not loss. Shift. The object's mass distribution was redistributing inward, condensing, converging toward the needle's base, like a body curling around a spine. The membrane contracted without tearing, adjusting molecular bonds as though pre-coded to withstand forces far beyond anything a natural structure should survive. Then came the anomaly we could not explain. The object began pulling light into itself. A faint halo formed at its perimeter, not emission, but inversion. Photons drifting near the surface bent inward, as if the object were generating micro-lensing effects on a scale too controlled to be natural. Not enough to indicate a singularity, not enough to collapse space, but enough to leave no doubt. The object's internal geometry had begun to invert. The cavity disappeared completely, swallowed by its own walls. The arches flattened. The outer membrane became a lattice of shifting, shimmering tension, a cocoon tightening around the needle. "It's forming a core," I said quietly. "No," the older researcher whispered. "It's restoring one." A chill ran through me. Restoring implied absence. Absence implied loss. Loss implied something had taken the core away, and that raised the question none of us had dared consider. Was the object alone in this process? The collapse reached critical acceleration. Suddenly, a tremor passed through the structure. Not a quake, a ripple, mirroring the void, ripple we observed earlier. The collapse paused. The membrane froze in mid-fold. The entire structure held still, as though listening. A faint oscillation traveled down the needle, matching the exact sequence we had recorded earlier. 6, 3, 1. A returning call. It's receiving instructions, the older scientist whispered. From what? Someone asked. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. A second tremor arrived, this one stronger, and the shell resumed folding. But now the collapse was not mechanical. It was organic, deliberate. Like an embryo curling inward during a final stage of formation, the needle retracted slightly, not away from the ripple's coordinates, but deeper into the newly forming core. The lattice tightened. The mass distribution shifted again. Sensors registered a spike in coherent oscillation, and then the object entered a state we had never seen before. Mass silence, no movement, no emissions, no radiation, no photonic reflection, no thermal activity. It existed, but only barely. It's phasing, I whispered. The older researcher nodded, just like the tip did. The realization struck me with cold clarity. The collapse wasn't an ending. It was a realignment, with something beyond our detection, beyond our physics, beyond our reach. And then the final stage began. The object folded until only a dark sphere remained, featureless, silent, denser than before, yet paradoxically weightless in behavior. The sphere pulsed once, a deep internal heartbeat. Then it released a wave, not outward, inward. A shockwave with no expansion, no pressure, no violence. A shockwave that moved only through the sphere itself, as though erasing its former geometry. And with that pulse, the sphere changed state. It didn't vanish. It didn't shrink. It didn't implode. It simply shifted. Its matter reorganized into a configuration that no longer interacted with our sensors in conventional ways. We're losing it, an analyst cried. Not losing it, the older researcher said. It's transitioning. To what? I demanded. He stared at the sphere, and for the first time since we began this investigation, I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. Not scientific uncertainty, not concern, but recognition. I've seen this state once before, he whispered, in a star system whose data was suppressed. The collapse always ends the same way. And how is that? I asked. He exhaled slowly, his voice hollow. It becomes something else. Before I could ask what he meant, the sphere pulsed again, and the readings spiked so violently that half the equipment froze. Something inside the sphere was coming online, and not by accident. There are moments when every instrument around you keeps running, every light stays green, every gauge holds steady. Yet you know with absolute certainty that the world has just crossed a threshold it cannot step back from. That was the moment the core revealed itself. The dark sphere at the center of the fold did not brighten, did not rotate, did not emit anything our detectors recognized as energy. It simply changed state. A shift, the kind that does not belong to visible transformations, but to what happens underneath the skin of reality. We watched as the last trace of the lattice dissolved, replaced by a surface that refused to follow any known physical behavior. It wasn't metallic. It wasn't plasma. It wasn't mineral. It wasn't void. It was surface as instruction, like matter rearranged to express a command. The older researcher leaned forward, staring at the sphere with an expression I could only describe as recognition. You don't ever want to see recognition on the face of someone who has spent his life studying forbidden data. He whispered, "This is the same phase I saw in the Vega files." A silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. I felt my breath catch. The Vega files were a myth. A rumor whispered among researchers. A supposed misalignment in data tracking from a star system 25 light-years away, where a sequence of readings had been captured and then immediately suppressed by central agencies. If those readings were real, and if what we were seeing now matched them, then this object was not improvising. It was following a pattern. The sphere pulsed again, almost imperceptibly, and a faint distortion appeared around its perimeter. Not heat, not gravity. Something subtler. Like the boundary between the sphere and the surrounding space had become negotiable. A boundary should never be negotiable. There was an unease in the room, the kind that slides behind your ribs and tightens slowly, like invisible hands. One of the younger analysts checked the lens array. "I still can't get a reflection," she said. It's absorbing light, but not in a normal spectrum. Not absorbing, the older researcher corrected. Redirecting. He tapped the screen, tracing a faint outline. It's folding incoming photons along its surface. It's behaving like a boundary layer between two different geometries. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. He wasn't looking at a structure. He was looking at a threshold. The core trembled, almost delicately, and a slit appeared along its side. A thin line of pure darkness, darker than the sphere itself, like a wound that did not bleed. "What is that?" someone asked. "A vent?" another suggested. "No," the older researcher whispered. "It's an aperture." An aperture implies purpose. Purpose implies intention. Intention implies design. We all felt the air change, though there was no air to change inside the observation feed. Something about the slit gave the sense of being watched, not by eyes, by geometry that had learned how to look. The aperture widened, just slightly. A glow emerged. Not light, something older, colder. I felt a pressure in my chest as if my heartbeat were sinking, to a slower, deeper rhythm emanating from the core. A rhythm not meant for human bodies. The older researcher stepped closer to the display, lowering his voice to a whisper meant only for himself. "I've seen this exact phase transition once before," he said, "in a fragment of data that should never have survived the purge." "What did the core become then?" I asked. He exhaled shakily. "It became a recorder." The word hung in the air like static. "A recorder?" someone repeated. "Not of sound," he said. "Not of images. Of space-time state. It stores events as geometry." "Why?" another analyst asked. His eyes stayed locked on the aperture. "To carry memory across star systems." A shiver went through me, because if this object had been carrying memory, then the collapse wasn't destruction. It was reassembly. It was restoration. The slit trembled, and a pulse of resonance traveled across the surface, distorting it like fabric struck by a stone. Patterns emerged. Triangular ridges arranged in fractal repetition, repeating in perfect ratios, cascading across the sphere. The older researcher swallowed hard. "This is an information lattice. The object is rewriting itself." "Into what?" I whispered. "Into whatever it was before we found it." That thought hit with the weight of an ocean. The sphere pulsed for the third time, and our sensors jumped. Not violently, precisely, like something calibrating its internal architecture. Suddenly, the aperture froze. A single line of thin, luminescent material extended outward, stopping just short of breaching the sphere's perimeter. It hovered in place, trembling with a low, harmonic hum. "What is that?" someone asked. The older researcher took a step back. "It's a probe," he said softly. "Not ours. Its own." "A probe for what?" "To test whether the environment outside matches the environment it expects." The phrase triggered a deep unease. Environment it expects. Expect implies memory. Memory implies experience. Experience implies origin. A ripple passed through the probe, and a sequence of geometric pulses flashed along its length. 6, 3, 1. The same sequence we had seen earlier, the same triad that kept reappearing like a buried refrain. "Why that sequence?" I murmured. The older researcher didn't look away from the core. "Because it isn't a message. It's a handshake." My breath caught. A handshake. With what? With whatever this object was linked to before it ever entered our solar system. The core responded. The probe retracted, folding neatly back into the aperture. The aperture sealed without a trace. The sphere hardened, its geometry stabilizing into a form that felt unnervingly deliberate. Then came the reading we did not expect. Mass increase. Sharp. Immediate. Impossible. "It's adding something," an analyst whispered. "No," the older researcher said. "It's receiving." Receiving. The word chilled me. What could it possibly be receiving? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Instructions. The sphere vibrated once, a final decisive pulse that swept through the sensors like a cold wind passing through a sealed room. And with that pulse, the core became impossibly still. Not dormant, not inactive. Waiting. A presence, not a structure. Watching us through a geometry that was never meant to be seen by eyes like ours. In that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt the overwhelming certainty that we had not discovered this object. It had allowed itself to be found, and whatever came next would not be for our benefit. There is a threshold in every investigation when silence stops being absence and becomes an active response. That was the hour the sky answered. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with a burst of light or the shudder of distant thunder. It arrived the way true revelations always do. Softly, quietly, with a precision that felt almost polite. It began with a shift in background radiation, a dip so faint that no one would have noticed it if the core hadn't been in its waiting state. The ambient cosmic noise, normally a steady, predictable wash, thinned by a fraction of a fraction, like a single grain of sand removed from a desert. And yet the readings around the core changed instantly, as if it sensed the slightest tremor across an ocean it was built to navigate. On the surface of the sphere, a ripple appeared. One ripple, nothing more. But it traveled with a deliberate slowness, the kind that communicates awareness, the kind that says, "I heard that." A murmur spread through the observation room. No one wanted to speak too loudly, as though afraid sound might disrupt the unfolding response. "What caused that shift?" an analyst whispered. "The sky," the older researcher said quietly. "Something out there just acknowledged the handshake." The idea froze me. The handshake sequence we had seen, 6, 3, 1, may not have been an invitation. It may have been a beacon waiting for a reply. And now, something had replied. The cosmic background stabilized. Every frequency returned to normal. But the core did not. It pulsed. Once, then again. 2 pulses, slow, deliberate, impossibly synchronized with the shift outside. "Is that a reply code?" someone asked. "No," the older researcher said. "That's alignment." The sphere brightened slightly along its equator. Not visibly, our eyes saw nothing, but the sensors detected a thin band of structured emission, like a ring of space-time being tuned. The surface reconfigured at a microscopic level. The aperture reformed, but not as a slit. This time it was a circle, perfect, silent, unmoving. And then the data broke. Every console flickered in unison, not violently, rhythmically. A precise stutter, as though an invisible pulse were passing through the machines. "It's interfering with the system," the younger analyst said. "No," the older researcher murmured. "It's synchronizing with it." A line of code, no, not code, signal, appeared on the central display. A frequency, a number, a direction. "What is that?" I asked. The older researcher's face tightened. "That is a coordinate." The room fell into a suffocating hush. A coordinate implies location. Location implies sender. We watched as the number repeated. Not random, not drifting. Fixed, steady, certain. A beacon pointing to a point in the sky that had not yet existed in any human map. "Plot it," I said. The analyst tapped rapidly. The starfield shifted. Constellations reoriented. The system triangulated the coordinates. The location emerged. Not near a star. Not near a known object. Not near anything. A patch of space so empty, so unremarkable, that no catalog had ever bothered labeling it. A perfect void. "Why would anything send a response from there?" someone asked. The older researcher didn't blink. "Because whatever's there does not want to be found easily." I felt a slow dread tightening behind my ribs. "You think something is hidden there?" He nodded once, and now it knows we're watching. The core pulsed again. The aperture dilated. A second stream of data emerged, not coordinates this time, but a pattern, repeating intervals. 6, 3, 1, but reversed. "What does that mean?" I asked. The older researcher's voice was barely more than breath. "It means we answered the call first." My blood ran cold. If the core sent its handshake here, he finished the sentence for me. The reply came from something that expected it. The implication was devastating. This object wasn't stranded. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't lost. It was part of a network that had outlived distances too vast for our species to imagine, a network that was still active. Another shift in the radiation field rippled across our sensors, stronger this time. The coordinate line blinked. The core reacted instantly, its surface reconfiguring again with frightening speed. "It's preparing for something," someone whispered. The aperture widened. The entire sphere hummed with resonance, bending faint distortions around itself like a black lens in water. The older researcher took a step back. "Oh no," he said. "It's not answering us. It's answering the location." The screens flickered again. A faint, structured pulse came through. Not noise. Not interference. A message. But not for us. The core's geometry responded in a cascading wave, folding into patterns no architecture should be able to form. It aligned with the distant coordinates, forming resonant intervals that matched the reply frequency. "What does the message say?" the analyst asked. "It doesn't say anything," the older researcher said. "It activates." The sphere trembled, its harmonics rising in pitch. "Is it dangerous?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not dangerous," he said quietly. "Worse." "What's worse than dangerous?" "Deliberate." The core pulsed again, and the ripple that had once traveled through the object's outer shell now traveled outward, into the room, into the instruments, into the empty air itself. We felt it in our bones. A deep, inward pull, as though the universe were inhaling. The screens flashed white. The sensors screamed, the lights dimmed, and then everything went still. The core froze. Every instrument quieted. The coordinate line vanished from the screens. A single phrase remained, a phrase the system could not have generated on its own, a phrase we did not type, a phrase that appeared only once, flickering for less than a second, then gone. "Not yours." I stared at the blank screen, my heart pounding. "Not yours." A warning, a boundary, a reclamation. The older researcher swallowed hard. "It's telling us to stop." "Stop what?" "Stop looking." Outside, the sky remained quiet. Normal. Unassuming. But we knew better. The sky had answered, and whatever answered did not appreciate being seen. There are many kinds of silence in the universe: the silence of distance, the silence of vacuum, the silence of absence. But there is one silence older, heavier, more dangerous than all the rest: the silence that follows after something is spoken. That was the silence we found ourselves drowning in. The message, if it could even be called that, had vanished from the screen. "Not yours." A phrase that did not belong to any of our systems, any of our languages, any of our protocols. A phrase that appeared without code, without origin trace, without electromagnetic signature. A phrase that should not exist. And yet it did. The younger analysts exchanged uncertain glances. One of them tapped her console, still shaking. "It must be a glitch," she whispered. "It has to be. There's no possible way something external wrote to our system without—" The older researcher raised a hand. "That wasn't a glitch." He spoke with the weary certainty of someone who had spent too many years being proven right about things he wished were wrong. "It was a redirection." "A redirection from what?" I asked. He stared at the blank monitor, the faint reflection of the dormant core flickering across his glasses. "From whatever sits behind that coordinate." The thought tightened the air in my lungs. Behind. Not simply located at, not drifting in front of, not aligned with, behind, as if the coordinate was not a point in space, but the surface of a deeper boundary. Suddenly, the temperature in the observation room dropped. Not mechanically, not from the AC system, but from the walls themselves, a cold that seeped into joints and bone, as if the room had fallen into shadow without losing its light. The core reacted. A faint shimmer passed across its surface, like frost forming on the skin of a salt pond. But it wasn't freezing. It was resonating, as though the sphere had heard something we could not. The older researcher stepped closer. "It's receiving again." My throat tightened. "What is it receiving?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, with a hoarse voice, "A silence." I frowned. "A silence isn't a transmission." "Sometimes it is," he murmured. The sphere pulsed. A slow, gravitational flutter that pressed gently against our chests. Not painful, not forceful, just invasive. "It's testing our presence," one analyst said, trembling. "No," the older researcher said. "It's testing our persistence." The distinction felt razor-thin and terrifying. One of the consoles flickered. The radiation array attempted to reconnect to the coordinate, failed, tried again, failed, again. The system automatically repeated the request, a machine's instinct to understand. But on the fifth attempt, everything froze. Then, all at once, every monitor went black. Alarms did not trigger, power did not surge. Everything simply stopped as though time itself had paused inside the room. We stood in a darkness so complete it felt sentient. A faint crackling sound traveled through the floor, through the tables, through our own teeth. A vibration so subtle it might have been imagined, if not for the fact that every one of us felt it in the exact same second. Then the screens lit up again. Not with system data, not with error messages, but with a single repeating waveform, a silent curve, smooth and unbroken, stretching across every monitor. "Is that a signal?" someone whispered. "No," the older researcher said. "That's a suppression field." My stomach dropped. "A suppression of what?" He exhaled slowly. "Observation." The word struck like a blow. "Are you saying," I whispered, "that something is telling us not to observe it?" "It's not telling us," he said. "It's enforcing it." The sphere trembled again. Its surface rippled inwards, not collapsing, not expanding, as though shrinking itself behind an invisible curtain. And then it happened. The cameras died. Not failed. Not glitched. They went dark, all at once, feeds severed with surgical precision. "What the?" one analyst gasped, yanking her headset off. "My auxiliary feed is gone, completely gone." "It cut the optical channels," someone else said. "No," the older researcher whispered. "It hid from them." Hid. Not from us. From the act of being seen. The distinction made my blood run cold. The core had entered a state we'd never documented before, a visibility collapse. A phenomenon theoretical physicists had speculated about in the context of advanced civilizations but had never observed, a state in which an object is present but can no longer be recorded. "We're blind," one analyst said. "We're being made blind," the older researcher corrected. The sphere pulsed again. This time, the pulse was deeper, an inward draw, as if the core was inhaling for the first time. "What does it want?" I murmured. The older researcher didn't take his eyes off the readings, the few that remained functional. "It doesn't want anything from us," he said quietly. "It wants us to step away." My voice felt thin. "What happens if we don't?" He finally looked at me. "That message on the screen," he said. "That wasn't a threat." A long pause. It was a boundary. Something inside my chest tightened. A boundary enforced by what? He nodded toward the dead cameras. By a network that does not want its nodes exposed. Before I could respond, the sphere suddenly brightened, a flash not of light, but of presence. Every sensor spiked, then flatlined. A harmonic tremor passed through the room. Every metal surface vibrated, papers fluttered, even the air felt like it quivered, and then everything went still. The older researcher whispered, his voice barely audible. "This silence, it's not passive anymore." "What is it?" I asked. He closed his eyes. "A warning. A warning from a void that had found us watching. A warning from a network that had noticed our persistence. A warning from a sky that had decided there were lines humans were not meant to cross." The silence settled over us with a weight too heavy to breathe under. A silence that did not say, "Stop." A silence that said something far more chilling. Do not continue. There are thresholds in science that we cross because curiosity demands it, and there are thresholds we cross because we convince ourselves that knowledge, any knowledge, is harmless. But then there are thresholds that do not feel like discoveries at all. They feel like trespassing, violating a boundary we were never meant to step over. This was the third kind. The room had fallen into a silence so dense it felt older than sound. Every instrument lay dim, every feed cut, every display blank. The only thing left active in the entire chamber was the core, the sphere that had sealed itself behind a veil of geometry and a warning we did not understand. Do not continue. The phrase still burned behind my eyes. Not yours. Do not continue. 2 sentences. No language, no dialect, just pure intent. The older researcher stood motionless, staring at the dead monitors as if waiting for them to turn on by themselves. They didn't. The suppression field hadn't ended. It had settled like a fog too heavy to disperse, suffocating every attempt at observation. "We should leave," one analyst whispered. "No," another said. "If we step away now, we lose everything." "We've already lost everything," the older researcher murmured. "We just don't understand the scale yet." I felt an unease crawling up my spine, the kind of instinctive alarm that belongs to animals, not scientists. A quiet voice in my head kept repeating, "You were not meant to see this. You were not meant to witness the network respond. You were not meant to cross this line." Yet we remained. The core pulsed again, a small vibration, subtle, like the heartbeat of something deciding whether to wake or withdraw. The air tightened around us. The lights flickered, then steadied, not because the system recovered, but because the sphere allowed it. "What is it doing now?" I asked softly. The older researcher shook his head. "It's waiting." For what? For us to make a choice. I stared at the dark sphere, silent, still, floating in the air like a question older than humanity. Waiting. Watching. Only this time the watching wasn't metaphorical. A faint shimmer appeared along one side of the core, a distortion in the air, as if the space touching its surface were trying to resolve into a shape. But it never did. It hovered at the edge of revelation, then receded, as though the sphere had reconsidered letting us see anything more. The older researcher inhaled sharply. "It's masking itself more aggressively." "Why?" I whispered. His voice cracked. "Because it knows we're still here." The words sank into me like ice. We weren't just observing. We were refusing to stop observing. And whatever lived behind that coordinate, whatever answered the handshake, whatever asserted that warning, was now watching our refusal. An analyst typed frantically at her disabled console. "Maybe we can bypass the suppression field if we route the feed." She stopped. Her screen flashed white, then black, then white again. A phrase appeared, not English, not code, not any recognizable structure. A waveform rendered as text, 3 symbols that felt like the echo of the earlier warning. The room dimmed. The suppression field tightened. "Did it just warn us again?" she whispered. "No," the older researcher said. "That wasn't a warning." "Then what?" "A consequence." My breath caught. "What consequence?" He raised trembling eyes toward the sphere. "It's closing the threshold." I felt the world tilt. "The threshold to what?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because the sphere pulsed, a deep, resonant inward pull, and for the first time, the darkness on its surface bent. A slit appeared, the same aperture as before, but colder, deeper, shaped by something that had given up on being understood. The aperture did not open outward. It opened inward. We weren't seeing an entrance. We were seeing a retreat. "It's withdrawing," the older researcher whispered. "To where?" He stared at the slit, his face illuminated by its impossible geometry. "To a state where we cannot follow." Something about that idea felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. as if the sphere was not simply shielding itself, but stepping out of our world like someone quietly exiting a room because the conversation had become too intrusive. Then the temperature dropped again. A pressure built behind my ears. A static hum crawled along the walls. The aperture trembled as if straining against a decision. "What is it waiting for?" I whispered. The older researcher swallowed, his voice almost gone. "It's waiting for us to let go." Before I could respond, the sphere emitted a single pulse, a sharp, focused, downward-pointing beam. Not light, not radiation, a vector, a direction. "What did it just do?" an analyst asked, panicked. "It marked something," the older researcher said quietly. "Something in this room." A chill went through me. "Marked what?" He hesitated. Then, "Us." I stepped back instinctively, but the beam faded immediately, as if the act of marking was complete. "What does it want from us?" I whispered. "It wants distance," he murmured. "It wants separation." My voice trembled. "And if we don't give it that?" The older researcher stared at the sphere, or at the aperture that was slowly closing. The suppression field thickened. The monitors browned out again. Every attempt at observation died. His answer came softly, almost as if he regretted saying it aloud. "Then whatever is behind that coordinate will enforce it for us." A dread settled over me. Cold. Heavy. I felt as though a hand I could not see had pressed against my chest. The threshold we crossed had been ours. The threshold now closing was theirs. The aperture sealed. The sphere's surface turned opaque. The suppression field locked into place. The sky's message had been simple. Not yours. Do not continue. And now the sphere was making good on that boundary. I found myself whispering a question I didn't want to ask. What happens next? The older researcher finally turned to me, his expression etched with a fear that no scientific training could suppress. "We stop," he said. "Or we are stopped." There is a point in every investigation when you stop asking, "What is it?" and start asking the only question that truly matters. Should we continue? We had reached that point. Not by choice, but by force. The sphere floated at the center of the chamber, silent, sealed, wrapped in a suppression field that felt less like a barrier and more like a hand pressed gently over our eyes. Around it, our instruments sat dead and obedient, like animals that knew not to move when a predator passed. No one spoke. Even breathing felt like a violation. The older researcher stood closest to the sphere, and in the faint glimmer of its impossible surface, I saw fear. Not of being harmed, but of understanding too much. He finally turned toward us. "We can't observe it anymore," he said. "And that is not an accident. It is a demand. A demand. Not a request. Not a negotiation. Not a warning. A line drawn in a language older than speech. What if it reactivates?" an analyst whispered. "What if it opens again?" He shook his head. "It won't open unless we cross the line it set." A silence tightened around the room. "And if we do?" I asked quietly. His answer was immediate. "Then whatever answered the needle," he paused as if the rest of the thought hurt to speak, "we'll make sure we don't get another chance." No one argued. No one needed to. The presence in the room, the weight behind that sealed aperture, made every objection feel childish. The sphere's surface shifted subtly, like a dark lens adjusting its focus. It wasn't aimed at us, not directly, but its awareness was unmistakable. It knew we were still here. It knew we were still watching, even if we could no longer see anything. The suppression field pulsed. A pressure built in the air, like the atmosphere preparing to hold back a storm. One of the younger analysts stepped back, shaking. "It doesn't want us in this room," she whispered. "It doesn't want us making the next mistake," the older researcher corrected softly. We were not being threatened. We were being managed. The realization twisted something in my chest. "It doesn't trust us," I said. He laughed once, bitterly. "Why would it? Look what we've done the moment we could see a sliver of its interior. We tore it apart with questions. We interrogated it with machines. We treated it like an object. My voice felt thin. Isn't it an object? He turned to me slowly. Objects don't set boundaries. A pause. Systems do. Networks do. Civilizations do. A shiver crawled along my spine. Not from cold, from understanding. The suppression field vibrated again, a reminder, not a threat. A soft urging. Enough. The older researcher walked closer to the glass, placing a hand against the surface. We've reached the point where the next decision isn't scientific, he said. It's ethical. His words cut through the fear and left something heavier behind. Ethical. The kind of choice that changes how a species sees itself. We have two options, he said quietly. We can step back, close this project, and honor the boundary. He hesitated, eyes still fixed on the sphere. Or we can keep pushing until something pushes back. The room felt smaller. And which option is correct? I asked. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, I saw the exhaustion of decades in the lines around his face. There is no correct option, he whispered. There is only the one we survive. The core pulsed, not in warning, not in hostility, but in finality. A soft, resonant beat that felt like a door locking. Every instrument flickered back to life for a fraction of a second, long enough to display a single reading. Access terminated. Then the suppression field darkened, and the chamber lights dimmed to a faint glow. The sphere had dismissed us. We should go, the older researcher said, his voice hollow. It's not ours anymore. A beat. It never was. No one moved at first. Leaving felt like surrender, and yet staying felt like defiance. So arrogant the universe itself had intervened. Finally, one by one, we stepped away from our stations and toward the exit. The door opened with its usual hiss, but the sound felt wrong, too loud in a room that no longer belonged to us. Before I crossed the threshold, I turned back one last time. The sphere floated silently, perfectly still, as if listening to something far beyond our reach. A node in a network we were never meant to discover. A messenger from a place where silence is not absence, but protocol. I whispered, more to myself than to the others. What happens when it decides to leave? The older researcher paused in the doorway. If it leaves, he said, we won't know. And if it stays? He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. Then the question isn't what it will do next. A long breath. It's whether humanity will respect the line it drew or pretend the line was never there. We stepped out. The door closed behind us. The suppression field hummed once, soft, satisfied. The chamber went dark. The decision had been made long before we realized we were the ones who had to make it, and the sky, for now, remained silent. But silence is not peace. Silence is not safety. Silence is not permission. Silence is waiting, a waiting that now includes us. So I leave you with the same question that haunted me long after the chamber lights died. Do you believe this was just a harmless interstellar object? Or do you believe we crossed a line and something out there drew one in return? If you stayed until this final moment, tell me what you think. Tell me whether you believe we should have stopped or whether we were right to look deeper. Comment. I stayed until the end. Because maybe the truth begins with those who choose to stay.